Welcome back to the Jesus Stories channel. Today's new story is The Brother History Forgot, Aaron's Hidden Legacy. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe to the channel. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
For most people, Aaron is simply remembered as the brother of Moses, the man who stood beside the great prophet, the assistant, the supporter, the secondary figure in one of the Bible's most famous stories. But what if that picture is incomplete? What if Aaron was far more important, far more influential, and far more complicated than most people realize? He stood before Pharaoh when the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance. He became Israel's first high priest, the founder of a priestly line that would shape Jewish worship for centuries. Yet, he was also the man who allowed the golden calf to be made, a failure so devastating that it nearly destroyed Israel's covenant with God before it had fully begun. How can one person be associated with both extraordinary faithfulness and catastrophic failure? Why was Aaron chosen despite his weaknesses? And why does his legacy continue to echo throughout Jewish and Christian history thousands of years later? To understand Aaron is to explore one of the most fascinating leadership journeys in the entire Bible, a story of calling, responsibility, failure, judgment, mercy, and redemption. This is not merely the story of Moses' brother. This is the complete story of Aaron, the first high priest of Israel, the man who stood between the living and the dead, and one of the most complex figures in biblical history. Before Aaron became Israel's first high priest, before he stood beside Moses before Pharaoh, and before his name became permanently woven into the story of the Exodus, he belonged to a world defined by uncertainty, survival, and imperial power. To understand Aaron properly, we must begin long before the miracles, long before Mount Sinai, and long before the birth of Israel as a nation. His story starts in Egypt, one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. For centuries, Egypt dominated much of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East through its wealth, military strength, administrative sophistication, and religious influence. Massive temples rose along the Nile. Pharaohs commissioned monuments designed to project permanence and authority. Egyptian society was organized through a highly structured hierarchy, supported by government officials, priests, soldiers, craftsmen, and laborers. It was into the shadow of this powerful civilization that Aaron was born. According to the biblical record, Aaron belonged to the tribe of Levi, one of the 12 tribes descended from Jacob, later known as Israel. His father was Amram, and his mother was Jochebed. He was the eldest of 3 well-known siblings. Aaron came first, followed by Miriam, and then Moses. This detail may appear minor to modern readers, but within the culture of the ancient Near East, being the oldest son carried social significance. Age often brought authority, responsibility, and influence within both family and community structures. Long before Moses emerged as Israel's most famous prophet, Aaron occupied the position of elder brother. Aaron's childhood unfolded during a period the book of Exodus describes as increasingly difficult for the Israelites. A new Pharaoh had risen, who no longer remembered Joseph, the Hebrew official who had once played a crucial role in Egypt's survival during famine. Concerned by the growing population of the Israelites, Egyptian authorities imposed labor obligations and policies intended to control them. While historians continue to debate the precise historical circumstances behind these traditions, the biblical narrative consistently presents the Israelites as a vulnerable ethnic minority, living under the authority of a far more powerful state. Aaron therefore grew up in a society where questions of identity, loyalty, and survival were part of everyday life. Unlike Moses, whose early years would eventually place him within Pharaoh's household before leading him into exile in Midian, Aaron appears to have remained among the Israelites throughout his life in Egypt. This distinction becomes important later. While Moses spent decades away from his people, Aaron experienced the daily realities of Israelite life firsthand. He lived among the community, shared its concerns, witnessed its struggles, and remained connected to its social networks. By the time the Exodus story begins, Aaron would have possessed decades of familiarity with the people Moses was being called to lead. The Bible provides only limited details regarding Aaron's early adulthood, yet the information it does preserve is significant. Aaron married Elisheba, a woman connected to a respected family lineage. Together they had 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These names are more than genealogical details. They introduce individuals who would later become central figures in the emerging priesthood of Israel. Even before Aaron's public role began, the foundations of a future family legacy were already taking shape. In many respects, Aaron's story is not only the biography of one man, it is also the story of a household that would influence Israel's religious life for generations. From a historical perspective, Aaron's environment was shaped by more than politics and labor. It was also shaped by religion. Ancient Egypt possessed one of the most sophisticated religious cultures in the ancient world. Temples functioned as centers of worship, economics, and administration. Priests occupied influential positions within society. Sacred symbols appeared throughout public and private life. Gods were represented through images, rituals, festivals, and monumental architecture. Whether one lived near major cities or within smaller communities, religious ideas permeated daily existence. Aaron, therefore, grew up surrounded by one of history's most visually impressive religious systems. Understanding that background helps modern readers appreciate the cultural world from which the Israelites emerged. Another important factor often overlooked is the passage of time. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for generations. This was not a temporary residence. Entire lifetimes had been spent within Egyptian territory. Children were born there. Families expanded there. Communities developed there. For many Israelites, Egypt was the only world they had ever known. The promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob belonged to ancestral memory, but everyday life unfolded along the Nile. Aaron belonged to a generation living between those two realities, carrying the memory of ancestral promises while navigating the demands of present circumstances. This tension would later shape many of the challenges Israel faced during the Exodus journey. As Aaron grew older, he likely became known within the Israelite community as a mature and respected figure. The biblical text does not record dramatic episodes from these years, and that silence is itself revealing. Aaron's life before the Exodus appears remarkably ordinary. There are no accounts of military victories, prophetic visions, or political influence. Instead, he emerges from the background of Israel's collective experience. He was a husband, a father, a member of the tribe of Levi, and a participant in the life of an oppressed community. Yet, history often turns on individuals whose importance is not immediately obvious. At the time, Aaron could not have known that events were already unfolding beyond Egypt that would soon alter his future forever. Far away in the land of Midian, his younger brother Moses was about to experience an encounter that would transform not only their family, but the destiny of an entire people. When that moment arrived, Aaron's ordinary life would intersect with one of the most consequential stories in the history of the Bible. At the end of the previous chapter, Aaron was still living in Egypt, a respected member of the Israelite community, whose life appeared destined to follow a familiar path. Nothing in the biblical narrative suggests that he expected to become a national leader, confront the Egyptian monarchy, or play a central role in one of the most influential events in religious history. Yet, while Aaron remained among the Israelites, events were unfolding hundreds of miles away that would soon alter the course of his life. In the wilderness of Midian, his younger brother Moses was about to receive a calling that would reshape the future of an entire people. The story begins near a mountain, known in Scripture as Horeb, often associated with Mount Sinai. Moses had spent approximately 40 years in Midian after fleeing Egypt. The man who once grew up within Pharaoh's household was now living the life of a shepherd. From a historical perspective, this transition was extraordinary. In the ancient world, royal courts represented centers of power, influence, and education. Shepherding, by contrast, occupied a far more humble place within society. Yet, biblical narratives frequently place transformative encounters in remote locations rather than political centers. It is in this setting that Moses encounters the burning bush, one of the most famous scenes in the entire Bible. According to the book of Exodus, Moses notices a bush engulfed in flames that is not consumed by the fire. As he approaches, God calls to him and reveals a mission of enormous significance. The suffering of the Israelites has not been ignored. Their cries have been heard. Moses is instructed to return to Egypt and become the instrument through which God will confront Pharaoh and lead Israel out of bondage. What follows is one of the most revealing conversations in the Pentateuch, because it introduces not only Moses' calling but also Aaron's future role. Contrary to many popular retellings, Moses does not immediately embrace the mission. Instead, the text records a series of objections and questions. Moses asks who he should say has sent him. He wonders whether the Israelites will believe him. He expresses concern about his ability to speak effectively. The conversation reveals a man fully aware of the scale of the challenge before him. Returning to Egypt would mean confronting the most powerful ruler in the region and attempting to persuade both Pharaoh and the Israelites that dramatic change was imminent. The task appeared overwhelming. It is within this context that Aaron enters the narrative in a decisive way. In response to Moses' concerns about speaking, God tells him that Aaron, his brother, is already on his way to meet him. This detail deserves careful attention because it is easy to overlook. The text does not portray Aaron as a last-minute solution created after Moses hesitates. Instead, Aaron is already moving toward the meeting before Moses returns to Egypt. The narrative suggests preparation occurring on multiple levels simultaneously. While Moses receives his calling in Midian, Aaron is being positioned for his own role in the unfolding mission. God then explains the relationship that will exist between the two brothers. Moses will receive divine instruction, while Aaron will communicate the message to others. The arrangement reflects a partnership rather than a rivalry. Moses and Aaron are assigned different functions within the same mission. This distinction becomes important throughout the Exodus narrative. Modern readers sometimes focus so heavily on Moses that Aaron appears secondary. Yet the text repeatedly presents both men as participants in God's work. Their responsibilities differ, but the mission depends upon both. The meeting between the brothers is brief in the biblical account, yet it marks a turning point in Israel's history. After decades apart, Moses and Aaron reunite in the wilderness. Moses shares everything that has occurred, including the encounter at the burning bush, the divine commission, and the coming confrontation with Pharaoh. Aaron's response is noteworthy for its simplicity. Unlike Moses, whose dialogue with God includes multiple questions and objections, Aaron's reaction is characterized primarily by acceptance and action. The text offers no extended debate, hesitation, or resistance. Once informed of the mission, Aaron joins it. Historically speaking, this decision involved considerable risk. Egypt was not merely Aaron's place of residence. It was the center of imperial authority. Aaron understood Egyptian power firsthand because he had lived under it his entire life. Agreeing to challenge Pharaoh meant participating in a movement with uncertain outcomes and potentially severe consequences. Yet, the narrative presents Aaron as willing to step into that uncertainty. His role in the story begins not with public miracles or dramatic speeches, but with a decision to join a mission whose success was far from guaranteed. Upon returning to Egypt, Moses and Aaron gather the elders of Israel. This meeting serves as the first public stage of their partnership. Moses recounts what God has revealed, and Aaron communicates the message to the assembled leaders. Signs are performed to confirm the authenticity of their claims. According to Exodus, the response is overwhelmingly positive. The people believe that God has seen their suffering and intends to act on their behalf. They bow in worship, expressing hope that their long period of oppression may finally be nearing its end. This moment is significant because it establishes Aaron's credibility within the community before the confrontation with Pharaoh begins. Another aspect worth noting is Aaron's position within Israelite society at this point. Unlike Moses, who spent decades away in Midian, Aaron remained among the Israelites throughout the years of oppression. He understood their concerns, their fears, and their expectations. This familiarity likely helped facilitate communication between Moses and the people. While the biblical text does not explicitly emphasize this sociological dynamic, it helps explain why Aaron's presence would have been valuable during the early stages of the mission. He served as a bridge between a returning exile and a community that had remained in Egypt. From a literary perspective, Chapter 2 introduces one of the central partnerships of the Old Testament. Many biblical stories focus on individuals acting alone. The Exodus story is different. It repeatedly highlights cooperation between key figures. Moses and Aaron do not perform identical roles, but together they become the public leadership team through which the liberation narrative unfolds. Their relationship will face challenges in later chapters, yet at this stage the emphasis falls on unity of purpose. Both men are moving toward the same objective, even if their responsibilities differ. As the chapter closes, the situation remains unresolved. The Israelites have heard the message and responded with hope, but Pharaoh has not yet been confronted. Egypt remains unchanged. The structures of oppression are still firmly in place, yet something important has shifted. For the first time, organized leadership has emerged within Israel. Moses has returned. Aaron stands beside him. The message has been delivered. The stage is now set for the confrontation that will define the next phase of Aaron's life. Soon he will leave the relative safety of his community and walk into the courts of Pharaoh himself, carrying a demand that challenges the authority of the most powerful ruler in the ancient world. At the end of the previous chapter, Aaron and Moses had successfully delivered their message to the elders of Israel. For the first time in generations, the people dared to believe that change might be possible. They had heard that the God of their ancestors had seen their suffering and intended to act. Yet belief among the Israelites was only one part of the challenge. The far greater obstacle remained untouched. Egypt still controlled their lives. The labor system remained in place. Pharaoh remained on the throne. If the promises announced by Moses and Aaron were to become reality, those promises would have to confront the most powerful political authority in the region. The next stage of Aaron's story therefore shifts from the world of Israelite communities to the heart of Egyptian power itself. To understand the significance of this confrontation, it is important to appreciate who Pharaoh was within the ancient Egyptian worldview. Modern readers often imagine a king similar to other rulers in history. But Pharaoh occupied a much broader role. He was the head of government, commander of military forces, chief administrator of the state, and guardian of religious order. Egyptian society viewed the stability of the kingdom as closely connected to Pharaoh's authority. His position was not merely political, it carried profound religious significance as well. Challenging Pharaoh, therefore, meant challenging an entire system of power that had shaped Egyptian life for centuries. Into that environment walked Moses and Aaron, carrying a message that was both simple and revolutionary. They demanded that the Israelites be allowed to leave in order to worship the God of Israel. The request immediately exposed a clash between two fundamentally different claims to authority. Pharaoh represented the authority of empire. Moses and Aaron represented the authority of divine command. The conflict that followed would not be resolved through negotiation alone. It would develop into a prolonged struggle that would shape the identity of Israel for generations. The first recorded encounter reveals Pharaoh's attitude toward the request. According to Exodus, he responds by asking, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" The statement is significant because it identifies the central issue of the narrative. The question is not merely whether the Israelites will be released. The question is whose authority will ultimately prevail. Pharaoh does not recognize the God of Israel as someone whose commands require obedience. From his perspective, there is no reason to alter the existing system. Egypt is functioning according to its own political and religious assumptions. The demands presented by Moses and Aaron are therefore dismissed. In fact, conditions become worse. Pharaoh increases the labor burden placed upon the Israelites, forcing them to maintain production quotas while gathering their own materials. This development creates an immediate crisis. The people who had initially welcomed Moses and Aaron begin to question whether their intervention has made life more difficult rather than better. The narrative intentionally highlights this tension because liberation stories rarely move directly from promise to fulfillment. Obstacles often intensify before resolution appears. For Aaron, this period likely involved considerable pressure. He had publicly associated himself with a mission that now seemed to be producing negative results, yet the confrontation with Pharaoh was only beginning. One of the most memorable episodes soon follows. God instructs Moses and Aaron to perform a sign before Pharaoh. Aaron throws down his staff, and it becomes a serpent. Egyptian magicians respond by performing a similar feat through their own arts. Then Aaron's serpent consumes theirs. Ancient audiences would have recognized the symbolic significance of the event. Serpents occupied an important place within Egyptian royal imagery. The cobra, in particular, appeared on royal crowns as a symbol of authority and protection. The sign therefore functioned as more than a demonstration of power. It communicated a challenge to Egyptian claims of legitimacy and supremacy. Nevertheless, Pharaoh remains unconvinced. The conflict escalates into the sequence traditionally known as the 10 Plagues. One detail frequently overlooked in popular retellings is Aaron's direct involvement in several of these events. While Moses remains the central prophetic figure, the biblical text repeatedly describes Aaron carrying out specific actions connected to the judgments upon Egypt. During the plague that turns water into blood, Aaron stretches out his staff over the waters. During the plague of frogs, Aaron again extends his staff. His participation is active and visible. The narrative does not portray him as a silent observer standing behind Moses. He functions as a key participant in the unfolding confrontation. The plagues themselves have generated extensive discussion among historians, theologians, and biblical scholars. Some interpret them primarily as supernatural interventions. Others explore possible natural phenomena that may have contributed to the sequence of events described in Exodus. Still others emphasize the literary and theological dimensions of the narrative. While interpretations differ, many scholars have noted that several plagues appear to affect areas closely associated with Egyptian religion and daily life. The Nile River, agricultural productivity, animals, health, darkness, and social stability all come under pressure. The cumulative effect is to demonstrate the vulnerability of a society that appeared invincible. Throughout these events, Aaron repeatedly appears in situations requiring public courage. It is easy to overlook this fact because later chapters often focus on his failures or priestly responsibilities. Yet, during the confrontation with Pharaoh, Aaron consistently stands at the center of a dangerous and unpredictable conflict. Each appearance before Pharaoh carries risk. Each rejected demand increases tension. Each plague deepens the crisis. Unlike later chapters that explore Aaron's role within Israel, this section of the narrative places him directly within an international struggle involving empire, power, and national destiny. Another important aspect of chapter 3 is the gradual transformation occurring within the Israelites themselves. At the beginning of the confrontation, they remain a population of laborers living under Egyptian control. As the conflict unfolds, they begin to see themselves differently. The repeated appearances of Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh communicate a new possibility. The existing order is not permanent. Authority can be challenged. The future does not have to mirror the past. Aaron, therefore, contributes not only to the confrontation with Egypt, but also to the emerging identity of Israel. He becomes one of the public faces of a movement that is reshaping how an entire people understands its place in history. As the plagues intensify, Pharaoh's resistance continues. Temporary concessions are offered and withdrawn. Negotiations fail. The situation moves steadily toward a decisive conclusion. Yet, despite the growing severity of the judgments, the central issue remains unchanged from the very first encounter. Who possesses ultimate authority? Pharaoh claims ownership over the future of Israel. Moses and Aaron declare that Israel belongs to God. The answer to that question will soon arrive through the final plague and the events that follow. For Aaron, however, one fact is already clear. The ordinary man who once lived quietly among the Israelites in Egypt now finds himself standing before the most powerful ruler of his age. And the greatest chapter of the Exodus story has not even begun. The confrontation between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh had been building for months. Repeated warnings had been ignored. Successive plagues had struck Egypt. Temporary compromises had collapsed. Each encounter pushed the crisis closer to a breaking point. By the end of chapter 3, the question that dominated the narrative remained unresolved. Would Pharaoh continue to hold the Israelites under his authority, or would they finally be allowed to leave? The answer arrived through the final plague, an event that would permanently shape the religious memory of Israel and place Aaron at the center of one of the most important transitions in biblical history. Before that final judgment occurred, a set of instructions was given that would become foundational for future generations. According to Exodus 12, God spoke to Moses and Aaron and established detailed preparations for what would later be known as Passover. Each household was instructed to select a lamb, prepare it according to specific requirements, and mark the doorposts of their homes with its blood. The instructions were highly structured, reflecting the importance of the moment. This was not simply a practical measure connected to a single night in Egypt. It was also the beginning of a commemorative tradition intended to preserve the memory of Israel's deliverance. The inclusion of Aaron in receiving these instructions is significant, because it places him directly within the establishment of one of the most enduring observances in Jewish history, historically and theologically. Passover occupies a unique place within the biblical narrative. Many ancient societies celebrated military victories, royal achievements, or agricultural cycles. Passover commemorated something different. It remembered liberation from oppression. The annual observance became a way for future generations to participate symbolically in the story of deliverance. Long after the Exodus generation disappeared, Jewish families would continue recounting the events of Egypt and reminding their children that freedom formed part of their collective identity. Aaron stood at the beginning of that tradition. He was among those responsible for communicating the instructions that transformed a historical event into a lasting act of remembrance. The final plague struck Egypt with devastating consequences. Pharaoh's resistance finally broke. After repeated refusals, he ordered the Israelites to leave. The moment represented a dramatic reversal. The population that had lived under Egyptian control for generations suddenly found itself free to depart. Yet, the transition was far more complicated than a simple change in political status. The Israelites were leaving behind the only society most of them had ever known. Their ancestors had lived in Egypt for centuries. Families had been born there, worked there, and died there, even under oppression. Egypt remained familiar. Freedom introduced possibilities, but it also introduced uncertainty. Aaron now found himself helping lead a population into an unknown future. The biblical account describes the departure as both organized and symbolic. The Israelites carried provisions, gathered their families, and began moving away from the land that had defined their existence for generations. The event later became known simply as the Exodus, meaning departure or going out. Few episodes in biblical history have exercised a greater influence on religious thought. The Exodus became the defining act of deliverance in the Hebrew Bible. Prophets, psalmists, and later Jewish writers repeatedly looked back to it as evidence of God's faithfulness. Understanding Aaron's role in this stage is important because it demonstrates that his contribution extended beyond speaking before Pharaoh. He was also present during the birth of Israel as a free people. Yet freedom immediately created new challenges. A population accustomed to receiving orders now faced decisions. A community shaped by survival now faced the task of developing a national identity. The journey itself became part of that process. Shortly after leaving Egypt, the Israelites found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's pursuing forces and a body of water identified in the biblical text as the Sea of Reeds, often translated in English traditions as the Red Sea. The narrative focuses primarily on Moses during this event. But Aaron remained among the leadership guiding an anxious population through a moment of crisis. The people feared that their liberation was about to end in disaster. According to the biblical account, the waters parted, the Israelites crossed safely, and the Egyptian forces were overwhelmed, whether approached through faith, theology, or historical discussion. The crossing became another defining memory in Israel's understanding of itself. Egypt no longer controlled their future. The nation had crossed a boundary that could not easily be reversed. Following the crossing, a new phase of the journey began. The challenge was no longer escaping Egypt. The challenge was learning how to exist as a people outside Egypt. This transition occupies a significant portion of the biblical narrative, because liberation alone was never the final goal. The Israelites needed food, water, leadership structures, legal systems, and a shared sense of purpose. The wilderness became the environment in which these developments unfolded. Aaron's role during this stage is often overshadowed by later events at Sinai, yet it remains important. He continued functioning as one of the principal leaders, helping the nation navigate practical and social challenges. As shortages emerged, tensions rose. As expectations collided with reality, complaints increased. The difficulties of wilderness life exposed how deeply Egypt still shaped the people's thinking. Leaving Egypt physically proved easier than leaving it psychologically. Historical studies of migration and social transformation often note a similar pattern. Communities undergoing major transitions frequently struggle to redefine themselves. Old assumptions persist even after external circumstances change. The Exodus narrative repeatedly reflects this reality. The Israelites were no longer slaves, but they had not yet fully learned how to think as a free covenant people. This tension forms the backdrop for many of the wilderness stories that follow. Aaron's experience during this period would have provided valuable insight into the challenges facing the nation. Having lived among the Israelites his entire life, he understood the fears and uncertainties that accompanied such a dramatic transition. Another important development during the journey was the growing distinction between liberation and covenant. Many modern retellings focus heavily on the escape from Egypt, but the biblical narrative consistently points beyond that event. The destination was not simply geographical, it was relational. Israel was being led toward a covenant relationship with God that would define its identity. The journey through the wilderness, therefore, functioned as preparation for something larger. The people who left Egypt would soon arrive at Mount Sinai, where laws would be given, responsibilities established, and a new stage of Aaron's life would begin. By the end of this chapter, Aaron has moved far beyond the role he occupied at the beginning of the story. He is no longer merely an Israelite living under Egyptian rule. He is part of the leadership guiding a newly liberated people through one of the most significant transitions in their history. Yet, the greatest challenges have not yet appeared. The nation has escaped Pharaoh, but it has not yet learned how to live as a covenant community. That lesson awaits at Mount Sinai, where Aaron will encounter both extraordinary privilege and the most consequential failure of his entire life. The Exodus had changed Israel's circumstances, but it had not yet defined Israel's identity. The people were no longer slaves in Egypt, yet they were not simply a collection of former slaves wandering through the wilderness. According to the biblical narrative, they were being brought toward a covenant relationship that would shape every aspect of their future. That process reached a decisive turning point when the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai. Few locations occupy a more important place in the Old Testament. Sinai is not merely the setting for laws and commandments, it is the place where Israel formally becomes a covenant nation. For Aaron, the events at Sinai would prove especially significant because they placed him closer to the center of Israel's developing religious life than ever before. At the same time, they created the conditions for one of the most consequential decisions he would ever make. The biblical description of Sinai is filled with dramatic imagery. Thunder echoed across the mountain, lightning flashed through the sky. Dense clouds surrounded the summit. Smoke rose as though from a furnace, and the ground itself trembled. Ancient readers would have recognized these details as signs associated with divine presence and majesty. Across the ancient Near East, mountains often functioned as symbolic meeting places between heaven and earth. Yet the Sinai narrative presents something distinctive. The focus is not on human beings ascending toward the gods through ritual achievement. Instead, the emphasis falls on God initiating a covenant relationship with an entire people. The mountain becomes the setting for revelation, law, and national formation. Before any laws are given, the narrative establishes a critical principle. Boundaries are placed around the mountain. The people are instructed not to approach freely. This aspect of the story can feel unfamiliar to modern audiences, but it reflects an important theme within the biblical worldview. The God who delivered Israel from Egypt is not presented merely as powerful. He is also holy. The restrictions surrounding Sinai communicate that divine holiness is not something to be treated casually. Reverence, preparation, and obedience are required. These ideas will later become central to Aaron's future responsibilities, although, at this point in the story, that future has not yet fully unfolded. As events progress, Aaron's role begins to expand. Earlier chapters portrayed him primarily as Moses' spokesman and partner in confronting Pharaoh. At Sinai, he starts appearing in a more prominent position within Israel's leadership structure. One of the most remarkable moments occurs in Exodus 24. Following the covenant ceremony, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel are invited to ascend partway up the mountain. The text then describes an extraordinary encounter in which they behold a manifestation of God's presence and participate in a covenant meal. Scholars have debated the precise meaning of this passage for centuries. The language is deliberately careful and somewhat mysterious, yet regardless of interpretation, the significance is unmistakable. Aaron is included among a very small group granted access to a sacred experience unlike anything previously recorded in the narrative. This scene deserves special attention because it foreshadows developments that will occur later. Aaron is not yet high priest, but his inclusion in this event places him within the inner circle of Israel's leadership. He is increasingly associated with matters connected to worship, covenant, and sacred space. The narrative does not explicitly explain every implication, but it is preparing the reader for Aaron's future role. His position is gradually evolving from political and communicative leadership toward something more specifically religious. Another major development at Sinai involves the giving of the covenant laws. Modern readers often associate Sinai primarily with the Ten Commandments, but the biblical text presents a much broader body of instructions. These laws address worship, justice, community life, social responsibility, and covenant obligations. From a historical perspective, the covenant functions as the constitutional framework of the emerging nation. Israel is no longer defined solely by ancestry or shared experience. It is now being shaped by a common relationship with God, expressed through covenant commitments. Aaron stands within the leadership responsible for helping the people navigate this transformation. Yet Sinai is not only a place of revelation, it is also a place of waiting after the covenant ceremony. Moses ascends the mountain for an extended period. According to Exodus, he remains there for 40 days and 40 nights. During that time, he receives additional instructions concerning worship, the tabernacle, sacred objects, priestly garments, and the structure of Israel's future religious life. While Moses remains on the mountain, Aaron stays among the people below. This detail is more important than it may initially appear. The narrative now places Aaron in a unique position. Moses is absent. The people remain uncertain about what is happening above. Communication is limited. The future remains unclear. Aaron becomes the most visible leader within the camp. Historical studies of leadership often observe that periods of uncertainty create pressure within communities. People seek reassurance, direction, and tangible evidence that events remain under control. The Sinai narrative reflects exactly this dynamic. The Israelites have witnessed remarkable miracles. Yet, they are still a newly liberated population, navigating unfamiliar territory. Their confidence remains fragile. Moses' prolonged absence therefore creates a situation that is both political and psychological. Questions begin to emerge. How long will he be gone? What happens if he does not return? What should the people do next? Understanding this context helps explain the tension building beneath the surface. The chapter also contains a striking irony that becomes clear only in retrospect. While Moses is receiving instructions concerning the tabernacle and the future structure of Israelite worship, the people below are becoming increasingly restless. Even more significant, Many of the instructions Moses receives concern a religious system in which Aaron himself will play a central role. The garments of the high priest, the sacrificial system, and the organization of sacred service are all being established. Yet Aaron does not yet know the full extent of what is being prepared. The reader, however, can see the contrast developing. On the mountain, plans are being made for the future of covenant worship. Below the mountain, impatience is beginning to spread through the camp. By the end of this chapter, Sinai stands as both a place of extraordinary privilege and growing tension. Aaron has witnessed events experienced by very few people in biblical history. He has participated in covenant ceremonies, approached sacred space, and occupied an increasingly important place within Israel's leadership. Yet he now faces a challenge unlike any he has encountered before. The threat does not come from Pharaoh, Egyptian armies, or external enemies. It comes from uncertainty within the community itself. As Moses remains on the mountain and the days continue to pass, pressure begins to build. The decisions Aaron makes next will shape how generations remember his name. For despite all the remarkable experiences at Sinai, the mountain is about to become the setting for the most infamous episode of Aaron's entire life, the disaster of the golden calf. At the end of the previous chapter, Aaron stood in a position of unusual importance. He had accompanied Moses during the Exodus, participated in covenant ceremonies at Sinai, and become one of the most visible leaders within Israel. Yet, as Moses remained on the mountain receiving further instructions, a new problem was emerging below. The issue was not a lack of miracles. The Israelites had witnessed the plagues in Egypt, crossed the sea, and experienced divine provision in the wilderness. The issue was uncertainty. Their leader had disappeared into a mountain covered with cloud, fire, and smoke, and 40 days had passed without his return. In that atmosphere of waiting and anxiety, the nation faced a test that would expose a deeper struggle concerning worship, identity, and trust. The result would become one of the most famous and controversial episodes in the entire Old Testament. The crisis begins with a simple but revealing observation. The people gather around Aaron and declare that they do not know what has happened to Moses. The statement is important because it highlights how much their confidence had become attached to a visible leader. Moses had served as the central figure in the confrontation with Pharaoh, the crossing of the sea, and the covenant at Sinai. His prolonged absence created a vacuum that many within the community found difficult to navigate. Ancient societies often depended heavily upon visible symbols of authority, and the Israelites were no exception. The uncertainty surrounding Moses' whereabouts quickly transformed into a demand for action. The people asked Aaron to make gods who would go before them. Modern readers often interpret this request purely through the lens of rebellion, but understanding the broader historical context helps explain why the demand emerged. For generations, the Israelites had lived in Egypt, one of the most visually religious civilizations in the ancient world. Temples, sacred images, divine symbols, and ritual objects surrounded everyday life. By contrast, the God of Israel could not be represented by an image. This distinction lay at the heart of the covenant. Yet habits shaped over centuries do not disappear immediately. When uncertainty increased, many people instinctively gravitated toward forms of religious expression that felt familiar and tangible. Aaron's response remains one of the most debated moments in his entire life. Rather than refusing the request outright, he instructed the people to gather their gold jewelry. The gold was collected, melted, and fashioned into a calf-shaped image. The symbolism of the calf has generated extensive discussion among scholars. Throughout the ancient Near East, bulls and calves were frequently associated with strength, fertility, kingship, and divine power. Similar imagery appeared in various neighboring cultures, including Egypt and Canaan. The calf, therefore, would not have appeared as a random choice. It reflected religious symbolism already familiar within the broader cultural environment of the region. One important question has occupied interpreters for centuries. What exactly did Aaron intend by creating the calf? The biblical text records the people proclaiming that this image represented the God who brought them out of Egypt. Some scholars argue that the calf functioned as a replacement deity, an outright act of idolatry. Others suggest that certain participants may have viewed the image as a representation associated with the God of Israel, rather than a completely different God. This distinction occasionally appears in academic discussions because Aaron later announces a festival connected to the Lord. However, regardless of how participants understood the image, the biblical narrative itself leaves little doubt about its evaluation. The event is presented as a serious violation of covenant worship. Even if some believed they were honoring the God who delivered them, they were doing so through means explicitly prohibited by the covenant established at Sinai. The problem was not merely theological confusion, it was disobedience. The timing of the event intensifies its significance. While the people below were creating the calf, Moses remained on the mountain, receiving instructions concerning the tabernacle, sacred worship, priestly garments, and the future structure of Israel's relationship with God. The contrast is striking. Above the mountain, plans were being established for covenant worship. Below the mountain, an alternative form of worship was already taking shape. The narrative deliberately places these developments side by side. The result is one of the sharpest contrasts in the entire Exodus account. As the celebration around the calf expanded, the situation deteriorated further. The biblical text describes sacrifices, feasting, and communal festivities. The atmosphere appears energetic and enthusiastic, yet the narrative portrays that enthusiasm as deeply misplaced. Enthusiasm alone does not determine whether worship is faithful. Throughout Scripture, sincerity and correctness are not always identical. People can be passionately committed to practices that ultimately contradict the principles they claim to honor. The golden calf episode illustrates this tension with unusual clarity. When Moses descends from the mountain carrying the stone tablets of the covenant, he encounters a scene that reveals the extent of the crisis. The people are gathered around the image. The covenant has been compromised almost immediately after its establishment. In one of the most dramatic moments in the Pentateuch, Moses throws down the tablets and shatters them. The action functions symbolically. The covenant relationship itself has been broken. The shattered tablets visually communicate what has already occurred spiritually and nationally. Moses then turns his attention to Aaron. Their conversation is among the most uncomfortable exchanges in Aaron's story. Moses asks what has happened and why Aaron allowed such a situation to develop. Aaron responds by describing the pressure exerted by the people and the sequence of events that led to the creation of the calf. His explanation has often been analyzed because it appears defensive in tone. Rather than accepting full responsibility immediately, he emphasizes the demands of the crowd and the circumstances surrounding the crisis. The text does not spend much time evaluating Aaron's words. Instead, it allows readers to observe the situation and draw conclusions from the events themselves. From a leadership perspective, the episode reveals the challenges that emerge when public pressure collides with covenant obligations. Aaron found himself responsible for maintaining order among a large and increasingly anxious population. Yet the narrative suggests that preserving short-term stability came at the cost of violating fundamental principles. The decision may have reduced tension temporarily, but it created a far more serious crisis. The story therefore raises questions that extend beyond its ancient setting. How should leaders respond when popular demands conflict with established commitments? What happens when immediate concerns overshadow long-term responsibilities? These questions remain relevant far beyond the wilderness of Sinai. Historically, the golden calf became one of the defining cautionary episodes in Israel's collective memory. Later, biblical writers repeatedly referred to it as an example of covenant unfaithfulness. The event served as a warning about the dangers of abandoning foundational commitments in moments of uncertainty. For Aaron, personally, it became the most damaging incident of his public life. Future generations would never discuss his story without also discussing the calf. Yet, despite the severity of the event, the narrative does not end here. The consequences are significant. Judgment follows. Relationships are strained. Questions arise concerning the future. Nevertheless, Aaron's role within Israel's story is not finished. In fact, one of the most surprising developments in the entire narrative is about to unfold. The man most closely associated with the golden calf will not disappear from the story. Instead, he will soon become the central figure in the religious system God is establishing for Israel. That unexpected development raises an unavoidable question. After what happened at Sinai, why was Aaron not removed from leadership altogether? The golden calf incident left Israel facing one of the most serious crises in its early history. A covenant had been established at Sinai, only to be violated almost immediately. The people who had witnessed the plagues crossed the sea, and stood before the mountain of God had turned toward an image fashioned from their own gold. Aaron's involvement in the event made the situation even more complicated. As one of the nation's principal leaders, he had not merely observed the crisis, he had participated in decisions that helped create it. From a purely human perspective, many readers expect the story to end here. The logic appears straightforward. If a leader plays a central role in a national religious failure, removal from office would seem inevitable, yet the biblical narrative moves in a different direction. Aaron remains within Israel's leadership, and that development raises an important historical and theological question. Why was he not removed? The first step in answering that question is recognizing the seriousness of the offense. Modern discussions sometimes soften the golden calf episode, because later events in Aaron's life are so prominent. The biblical text does not. The covenant established at Sinai placed exclusive loyalty to God at the center of Israel's identity. The creation of the calf represented a direct challenge to that principle. The issue was not simply poor judgment or a temporary lapse in leadership. It involved the nation's relationship with the God who had delivered them from Egypt. Any explanation for Aaron's continued role must begin by acknowledging that the offense was genuinely severe. One of the most important pieces of evidence appears later in the book of Deuteronomy. As Moses reflects on Israel's history, he recalls that God's anger against Aaron was extremely serious during the aftermath of the golden calf. According to Moses' account, Aaron himself faced the possibility of destruction. This detail is significant because it prevents readers from assuming that Aaron escaped consequences automatically. The narrative does not suggest that his position protected him from accountability. On the contrary, it indicates that judgment against him was a real possibility. The question, therefore, shifts from whether Aaron deserved judgment to why that judgment did not take the form many readers expect. A major part of the answer lies in the role of Moses. Throughout the Exodus narrative, Moses repeatedly functions as an intercessor. He stands between God and the people during moments of crisis, pleading for mercy and appealing to the covenant promises given to the patriarchs. Following the golden calf incident, Moses intercedes not only for the nation but also for Aaron. This detail often receives less attention than it deserves. Aaron's future cannot be understood apart from Moses' intervention. The biblical text presents intercession as a significant factor in what follows. Moses does not deny the seriousness of the offense. Instead, he pleads for mercy in the midst of judgment. This pattern becomes a recurring feature of Israel's story and reflects a broader biblical theme concerning the preservation of covenant relationships despite human failure. At the same time, the narrative does not portray Aaron as continuing along the same path that led to the crisis. One of the notable features of the chapters following Sinai is the absence of any further involvement in idolatrous activity. The Aaron who appears later in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers is focused on very different responsibilities. The text does not provide a lengthy personal confession comparable to some later biblical figures, yet it does reveal a clear change in direction. Aaron's subsequent actions are connected to the worship system established through the covenant rather than alternatives to it. From a narrative perspective, this shift is important. The golden calf becomes a defining event, but it does not become the only event that defines him. Another factor involves the distinction between individual failure and divine calling. Throughout the Old Testament, leaders are often portrayed as complex figures whose lives include both significant achievements and significant mistakes. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Samson, David, and others all illustrate this pattern in different ways. The biblical writers rarely present their central figures as flawless examples. Instead, they portray them as participants in a larger story shaped by divine purposes. Aaron fits within that pattern. His failure at Sinai is recorded honestly, yet the narrative also continues to explore the role assigned to him within Israel's developing covenant life. This observation does not remove responsibility from Aaron. Rather, it helps explain why the story does not conclude with the golden calf. Historical context may also contribute to understanding the situation. By the time of the Sinai events, Aaron had already become an established figure within Israel's leadership structure. He had stood before Pharaoh, participated in the Exodus, and helped guide the nation through the early stages of the wilderness journey. The biblical narrative repeatedly presents him as part of a leadership partnership with Moses. Removing Aaron would therefore have implications extending beyond one individual's future. It would affect the broader structure through which Israel was being led and organized. While the text does not frame the issue in modern administrative terms, it does suggest that larger covenant purposes were still unfolding through Aaron's role. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this chapter is what it teaches about accountability. Aaron is not removed, but neither is the event forgotten. The golden calf remains part of his story permanently. Future readers encounter the incident again and again, because the biblical text preserves it without concealment. This balance is important. The narrative avoids two extremes. It neither erases the offense nor treats it as the only thing worth remembering. Accountability remains real, but the story continues. This approach reflects a broader characteristic of biblical storytelling. Important figures are remembered in their complexity rather than reduced to a single moment. The chapter also serves an important literary purpose within the larger narrative. Readers naturally expect consequences after a crisis of this magnitude. Instead of providing an immediate resolution, the text creates tension. Aaron remains present, but questions linger. What role will he play moving forward? How can someone associated with such a failure continue to occupy a position of influence? These unresolved questions generate anticipation for what comes next. The answer arrives in a surprising form. Rather than being excluded from Israel's religious future, Aaron becomes increasingly connected to it. The same narrative that records his involvement in the golden calf soon begins describing preparations for a sacred office unlike any previously established in Israel. Garments are designed, rituals are prescribed, responsibilities are defined. A new institution is taking shape, and Aaron stands at its center. This development does not erase the events at Sinai. In many ways, it makes them even more striking. The man whose leadership was questioned after the golden calf is about to become Israel's first high priest. Understanding how and why that happened is essential for understanding the rest of Aaron's story, because the next chapter marks the beginning of the role that would define his legacy for generations to come. At the end of the previous chapter, one question remained unresolved after the golden calf incident. Why did Aaron remain part of Israel's leadership? The biblical narrative answers that question not through abstract explanation, but through a series of concrete developments that begin unfolding in the latter chapters of Exodus. While readers might expect Aaron's role to diminish after Sinai, the opposite occurs. The text increasingly places him at the center of a new institution that will shape Israel's religious life for centuries. Detailed instructions are given concerning sacred space, sacrificial worship, ritual procedures, and priestly service. Within that framework, Aaron is selected to occupy a position unlike any previously established in Israel. He is consecrated as the nation's first high priest. This chapter focuses not on the priesthood as a system, but on the ceremony and significance of Aaron's personal appointment to that office. To understand the importance of the event, it is necessary to appreciate the challenge facing Israel at this stage of its development. The covenant had been established at Sinai, but covenant life required structure. The people now possessed laws, obligations, and a shared identity. Yet practical questions remained. How would worship be organized? How would sacred rituals be conducted? Who would oversee the sanctuary and its services? The books of Exodus and Leviticus devote extensive attention to these matters because worship occupied a central place within Israel's national life. Unlike surrounding empires where religion was often tied closely to royal power, Israel's covenant placed extraordinary emphasis upon ordered worship, directed toward the God who had delivered them from Egypt. Within that framework, priestly service became a necessity rather than an optional addition. The biblical text introduces Aaron's appointment with remarkable detail. Entire chapters are dedicated to describing the garments, ceremonies, sacrifices, and procedures associated with his consecration. This level of attention signals the significance of the office being established. Aaron is not simply receiving a new title. He is entering a role that carries unique responsibilities within the covenant community. His duties will differ from those of Moses. Moses functions primarily as prophet, lawgiver, and covenant mediator. Aaron's responsibilities will be centered on the sanctuary and the administration of worship. Together, the two offices create complementary dimensions of leadership within Israel. One of the first stages of the consecration ceremony involves washing. Aaron and his sons are brought before the congregation and cleansed with water. Ritual washing appears frequently throughout the Old Testament, particularly in contexts associated with sacred service. In the ancient world, washing could symbolize purification, preparation, and transition from one status to another. Here, it marks the beginning of Aaron's movement into a new role. The ceremony communicates that priestly service requires preparation before entering sacred responsibilities. Following the washing comes the clothing of Aaron in specially designed priestly garments. These garments receive extensive description in Exodus because they carry symbolic importance. Ancient societies often used clothing to communicate authority, social position, and function. The high priest's attire was therefore far more than ceremonial decoration. It visually identified the office he occupied. The garments included a tunic, robe, sash, ephod, breastpiece, and turban, each crafted according to specific instructions. The breastpiece contained 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. This detail is particularly significant because it demonstrates that the high priest's role was connected to the entire nation. Aaron did not serve merely as an individual religious official. He carried symbolic responsibility for all Israel. Another notable feature was the golden plate attached to the priestly headpiece, bearing the inscription often translated as "Holy to the Lord." The phrase captures one of the central themes of the consecration ceremony. The office being established was set apart for a specific purpose within the covenant relationship. In biblical language, holiness often refers to being dedicated or set apart for divine purposes. Aaron's clothing therefore communicated more than status. It communicated function. The garments visually distinguished his responsibilities from those of other members of the community. After the clothing ceremony, Aaron is anointed with sacred oil. Anointing held deep significance throughout the ancient Near East and appears in multiple biblical contexts. Kings, priests, and occasionally prophets were anointed as a sign of appointment to a particular role. The act symbolized authorization and dedication. In Aaron's case, the anointing formally marks the beginning of his priestly office. The ceremony publicly identifies him as the individual selected to fulfill these responsibilities. Sacrifices then form another major component of the consecration process. Modern readers sometimes find these rituals difficult to understand because they come from a cultural world very different from the modern West. Yet, within the context of ancient Israel, sacrifice served as a central expression of worship, dedication, thanksgiving, purification, and covenant relationship. The consecration offerings associated with Aaron emphasize the seriousness of the office he is entering. The rituals underscore that priestly service cannot be separated from covenant obligations. Every aspect of the ceremony reinforces the idea that sacred responsibilities require careful preparation and commitment. An important detail, often overlooked, is that Aaron does not undergo the consecration alone. His sons participate as well. This feature anticipates developments that will become increasingly important in later chapters. The priesthood is not being established merely as a temporary assignment for one individual. The ceremony already points toward continuity across generations. Aaron's family will play an ongoing role within the worship life of Israel, although the full implications of this development will not become clear until later. The seeds are planted here. The consecration is personal, but it also has future institutional significance. Historically speaking, the creation of the high priesthood represented a major development in Israel's religious structure. Prior to this point, leadership had been concentrated primarily around Moses and the events of the Exodus. The consecration ceremony introduces a more formal arrangement connected to the sanctuary and its services. This shift reflects the broader transition from a liberated population to an organized covenant community. As Israel's social and religious life becomes more structured, specialized offices begin to emerge. Aaron's appointment is one of the most important examples of that process. The ceremony concludes with a period during which Aaron and his sons remain at the entrance of the tabernacle, completing the prescribed rituals. The emphasis throughout the account is not on personal achievement or public recognition. Instead, the focus remains on preparation, dedication, and responsibility. The office of high priest is presented as a sacred trust rather than a personal reward. This perspective becomes especially important when viewed against the backdrop of earlier events. The narrative does not invite readers to compare Aaron's appointment with his previous failures. Instead, it directs attention toward the role itself and the responsibilities that accompany it. By the end of this chapter, Aaron has become the first high priest of Israel. The ceremonies have been completed. The garments have been placed upon him, and the office has been formally established. Yet the story of the priesthood is only beginning. Understanding Aaron's personal consecration explains how he entered the office. The next step is understanding how that office functioned within Israel's life, and why Aaron's descendants would continue occupying it long after his death. To explore that question, we must move beyond the ceremony itself and examine the birth of what would become known as the Aaronic priesthood. The previous chapter focused on Aaron's personal consecration as Israel's first high priest. The ceremonies, garments, sacrifices, and anointing rituals explained how he entered the office. Yet, an equally important question remains. What exactly was this office designed to accomplish? The biblical narrative quickly makes clear that Aaron's appointment was never intended to be an isolated event affecting only one individual. His consecration marked the beginning of a larger institution that would shape Israel's religious life for centuries. To understand Aaron's historical significance, we must move beyond the inauguration ceremony itself and examine the system that emerged around his office. This chapter therefore focuses not on Aaron as a person, but on the creation and function of the Aaronic priesthood. One of the first distinctions the biblical text establishes concerns the tribe of Levi. Modern readers sometimes assume that all Levites were priests, but the scriptures present a more specific arrangement. Aaron belonged to the tribe of Levi, yet priestly service was reserved for Aaron and his descendants. Other Levites performed important duties connected to the sanctuary, including transportation, maintenance, and assistance with worship, but they did not hold the same priestly responsibilities. This distinction became a defining feature of Israel's religious structure. All priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests. Understanding this difference is essential, because it explains why Aaron occupies a unique position within Israel's history. The emergence of the Aaronic priesthood is closely connected to the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that accompanied Israel during its wilderness journey. Before the construction of the temple in Jerusalem centuries later, the tabernacle functioned as the central location for national worship. According to the biblical description, it served as the focal point of Israel's covenant life. Sacrifices were offered there. Sacred rituals were conducted there. Important festivals and ceremonies revolved around it. The structure itself symbolized God's presence dwelling among His people. Maintaining and overseeing the activities associated with the sanctuary required organization, responsibility, and specialized roles. The priesthood emerged within that context. One of the primary responsibilities of Aaron and his descendants involved the administration of sacrifices. To modern audiences, sacrificial systems can appear unfamiliar because they belong to a world very different from contemporary religious practice. In the ancient Near East, however, sacrifice was a common feature of worship across many cultures. Israel's sacrificial system possessed distinctive characteristics, but it operated within a broader cultural environment where offerings formed part of religious life. The biblical texts describe several categories of sacrifices, including offerings connected to thanksgiving, dedication, purification, covenant obligations, and communal worship. Priests supervised these rituals and ensured that they were conducted according to the instructions associated with the covenant. Another major responsibility involved caring for the sanctuary itself. Sacred objects, furnishings, and ritual spaces required careful attention. The biblical narrative repeatedly emphasizes order within worship. This emphasis reflects a broader principle visible throughout the Pentateuch. Israel's covenant relationship was not intended to function through improvisation alone. Specific procedures governed many aspects of communal worship. The priesthood, therefore, served an administrative as well as a religious function. Priests preserved continuity, maintained standards, and provided structure within the life of the nation. Teaching also formed a significant part of priestly responsibility. While modern societies often separate educational and religious roles, ancient Israel viewed them as closely connected. The covenant included laws, regulations, ethical obligations, and communal expectations that required explanation and transmission from one generation to the next. Priests contributed to this process by helping preserve and communicate the traditions associated with Israel's relationship to God. Their responsibilities extended beyond ritual activity into the broader task of maintaining covenant knowledge within the community. This educational dimension is sometimes overlooked because discussions of the priesthood often focus primarily on sacrifices. Yet the preservation of collective memory and instruction was equally important. Among all priestly duties, one role stood above the others in symbolic significance. The high priest occupied a unique position within the system. While ordinary priests carried out many routine responsibilities, the high priest participated in ceremonies reserved specifically for his office. The most famous example appears in connection with the Day of Atonement, described extensively in Leviticus 16. On that occasion, the high priest entered the most holy place, the innermost section of the sanctuary. This event occurred only once each year and represented one of the most solemn moments within Israel's religious calendar. Although later chapters of Aaron's story will focus on personal events and leadership challenges, understanding this aspect of the priesthood is essential because it reveals the extraordinary importance attached to the office he inaugurated. Historically speaking, Aaron's appointment established more than a temporary leadership position. It created a hereditary institution. Aaron's descendants would inherit priestly responsibilities across successive generations. This development had long-term consequences for Israel's national life. Even after the wilderness period ended and the people settled in the land of Canaan, the Aaronic line continued to occupy central roles within worship. During the era of the monarchy, priests served at major sanctuaries and eventually within the temple in Jerusalem. During the Second Temple period, the high priest became one of the most influential figures in Jewish society. The institution founded through Aaron, therefore, outlived the wilderness generation by many centuries. Scholars studying ancient Israel often note that hereditary priesthoods were not unusual in the ancient Near East. Various cultures transmitted religious offices through family lines. What distinguished Israel's priesthood was not the concept of inheritance itself, but its integration into the covenant established at Sinai. The priesthood existed within a framework defined by covenant obligations, sacred law, and national identity. Aaron's descendants were not simply religious specialists. They became custodians of a tradition that shaped how Israel understood worship, holiness, and communal life. Another important feature of the Aaronic priesthood is its role in preserving continuity. Israel's history included periods of stability, crisis, conquest, exile, and restoration. Political leaders changed. Dynasties rose and fell. Yet, the priesthood provided a degree of institutional continuity across generations through changing historical circumstances. Aaron's lineage remained associated with the administration of worship and the maintenance of sacred traditions. This continuity helps explain why Aaron's influence extends far beyond the events recorded during his own lifetime. His significance is not limited to what he personally accomplished. It includes the institution that continued after him. From a literary perspective, this chapter marks a transition within Aaron's story. Earlier chapters focused primarily on events involving Egypt, the Exodus, Sinai, and the wilderness. The creation of the Aaronic priesthood expands the scope of the narrative. Aaron is no longer important solely because of his relationship with Moses or his participation in specific historical events. He has become the founding figure of an institution that will shape centuries of religious history. Yet, despite the significance of the priesthood, the biblical narrative quickly reminds readers that sacred offices do not eliminate personal challenges. In fact, the next major event in Aaron's life will emerge from within the priestly family itself. The institution has now been established, but the men serving within it remain human. And that reality is about to become painfully clear through a tragedy involving Aaron's own sons, Nadab and Abihu, the establishment of the Aaronic priesthood marked a major milestone in Israel's development as a covenant community. The tabernacle had been completed. The priestly offices had been organized, and Aaron had been formally installed as the first high priest. From a narrative perspective, the story appears to be moving toward stability. The structures of worship were now in place. The responsibilities of priests and Levites had been defined. Aaron's family stood at the center of a system that would shape Israel's religious life for generations. Yet, one of the most shocking events in the entire book of Leviticus occurs almost immediately after this promising beginning. Instead of celebrating a long period of success, the narrative abruptly confronts readers with a tragedy involving Aaron's two eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu. The event would become one of the most discussed and debated episodes in biblical scholarship because it raises profound questions about worship, holiness, and responsibility. To understand the significance of the incident, we must first consider the setting in which it occurred. The priesthood was still in its earliest stages. The inauguration ceremonies described in Leviticus had recently been completed. Sacrifices had been offered according to the prescribed procedures. The people had witnessed the formal beginning of a new phase in Israel's covenant life. Most importantly, the biblical text records a dramatic sign of divine approval. Fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the offering on the altar. The people responded with celebration and worship. From the perspective of the narrative, this was a moment of confirmation. The sacrificial system had begun operating as intended, and God's acceptance of the worship being offered appeared unmistakable. It is precisely at this point that the story takes an unexpected turn. Leviticus 10 records that Nadab and Abihu each took a censer, placed fire and incense in it, and offered what many English translations describe as unauthorized fire, or strange fire before the Lord. The text then immediately adds a crucial detail. They offered something that God had not commanded. This statement is the only explicit explanation provided within the narrative itself. While later interpreters have proposed various theories concerning the precise nature of their offense, the biblical text grounds the problem in the fact that their action lacked divine authorization. The result was immediate and severe. Fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before Him. One reason this story has generated so much discussion is that the text does not elaborate extensively on the details. Readers are told what happened and are given a basic explanation, but many questions remain unanswered. What exactly was unauthorized about the offering? Did Nadab and Abihu alter a prescribed ritual? Did they enter a forbidden area? Did they use fire from an improper source? The text does not specify. As a result, scholars and interpreters have examined the broader context in an effort to understand the event more fully. One widely discussed interpretation focuses on obedience. Throughout Exodus and Leviticus, worship is repeatedly connected to specific instructions: the construction of the tabernacle, the preparation of priestly garments, the offering of sacrifices, and the conduct of rituals all follow detailed prescriptions. From this perspective, the problem with Nadab and Abihu was not necessarily malicious intent. The issue was acting independently within an area where obedience to divine instruction was essential. Their action introduced an element into worship that God had not commanded. This interpretation remains influential because it aligns closely with the explanation provided by the text itself. Another interpretation examines the placement of the story within Leviticus. Immediately after the deaths of Nadab and Abihu, regulations are given concerning priests and the consumption of alcohol while serving in sacred contexts. Some interpreters have therefore suggested the possibility that the two men may have approached their duties while impaired. It is important to emphasize that this remains a theory rather than a stated fact. The biblical text never directly says that Nadab and Abihu were intoxicated. Responsible analysis requires distinguishing between what the text explicitly states and what later readers infer from contextual clues. The clearest conclusion remains the one provided by Scripture itself. They offered something God had not commanded. The status of Nadab and Abihu also adds weight to the story. These were not ordinary members of the community. Earlier in Exodus, both men had accompanied Moses and Aaron partway up Mount Sinai during the covenant ceremony. They had witnessed extraordinary events and occupied privileged positions within Israel's leadership structure. Their actions, therefore, carried greater significance than those of individuals with less responsibility. Ancient readers would have immediately recognized this aspect of the narrative. Greater access to sacred responsibilities often implied greater accountability. The issue was not merely what they did, but who they were and where they stood within the covenant community. The impact upon Aaron cannot be overstated. As high priest, he was responsible for the religious life of the nation. As a father, he had just lost 2 sons. The tragedy occurred at what should have been one of the proudest moments of his life. The inauguration of the priesthood was intended to mark a beginning. Instead, it became associated with devastating loss. The biblical account captures this emotional tension with remarkable restraint. After Moses explains that God's holiness must be honored among those who approach him, the text simply states that Aaron remained silent. This brief statement has attracted enormous attention from commentators throughout history. The silence may reflect grief, shock, submission, confusion, or a combination of all 4. The text does not explain. It merely records the response. In many ways, that restraint makes the moment even more powerful. Theologically, the story serves a specific function within Leviticus. The book repeatedly emphasizes holiness as a defining characteristic of Israel's relationship with God. Modern readers often focus primarily on divine mercy and compassion, themes that are undeniably important throughout Scripture. Leviticus, however, places special emphasis on the seriousness of sacred responsibilities. The deaths of Nadab and Abihu reinforce that message. The narrative demonstrates that worship is not simply a matter of personal preference or creative expression. Within the covenant framework, worship must be conducted according to the principles established by God. From a literary standpoint, the episode also marks a transition in Aaron's story. Earlier chapters focused on national events involving Egypt, Sinai, and the formation of the priesthood. This chapter shifts attention toward the personal cost associated with leadership. Aaron's responsibilities now intersect with family relationships, grief, and loss. The high priest is no longer merely a public figure. He becomes a father confronting tragedy while continuing to fulfill public duties. This dimension adds depth and complexity to his character. By the end of the chapter, the priesthood remains intact, but the atmosphere surrounding it has changed. The office has been inaugurated, yet its responsibilities now appear more serious than ever. Aaron has learned that sacred service carries consequences extending far beyond ceremonial honor. The lesson will remain with him as Israel continues its wilderness journey, yet the challenges facing Aaron are far from over. The next conflict will not emerge from the sanctuary or from priestly rituals. Instead, it will arise within his own family. Questions concerning authority, status, and leadership are about to surface among the very people who have shared his journey from the beginning, including his sister Miriam and his brother Moses. The death of Nadab and Abihu revealed the seriousness of priestly responsibility. But it did not bring an end to the challenges facing Israel's leadership. As the wilderness journey continued, The nation remained a complex community, navigating uncertainty, hardship, and constant transition. Questions of authority, responsibility, and decision-making surfaced repeatedly throughout the narrative. Most of those conflicts involved the broader population. Occasionally, however, tensions emerged among the leaders themselves. One of the most revealing examples appears in Numbers 12, where Aaron and Miriam challenge Moses. The episode is significant, not because it threatens the survival of the nation, but because it exposes the difficulties that can arise even among individuals who share the same mission, the same history, and the same family. To appreciate the importance of the event, it is worth remembering who these three figures were. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam had been connected since the beginning of the story. Miriam helped protect Moses during his infancy. Aaron became his spokesman during the confrontation with Pharaoh. Together, the three siblings participated in the Exodus, witnessed the crossing of the sea, and helped guide Israel through the wilderness. Each occupied a respected position within the covenant community. Moses functioned as prophet and national leader. Aaron served as high priest. Miriam was recognized as a prophetess and played a visible role in Israel's worship life. This shared history makes the conflict particularly striking. The challenge does not come from outsiders. It emerges from within the leadership circle itself. The chapter opens with criticism directed toward Moses concerning his Cushite wife. The reference is brief, and scholars have debated its precise meaning for centuries. Some interpreters identify the woman with Zipporah, Moses' Midianite wife. Others believe the text refers to a different marriage, not described elsewhere, because the narrative provides limited information. Certainty is difficult. More importantly, the complaint quickly shifts away from the marriage issue and toward a broader question. Aaron and Miriam ask whether the Lord has spoken only through Moses. They point out that God has also spoken through them. This statement reveals the central issue of the chapter. The conflict concerns authority rather than marriage. The question raised by Aaron and Miriam is understandable from a historical perspective. Both occupied important positions. Miriam possessed prophetic authority. Aaron served as high priest. Neither role was symbolic or insignificant. Their contributions to Israel's development had been substantial, yet Moses occupied a position unlike anyone else in the nation. He received direct revelation, communicated covenant instructions, and functioned as the primary mediator of God's guidance to Israel. The distinction between Moses and other leaders appears repeatedly throughout the Pentateuch. Numbers 12 forces that distinction into the open. Why should Moses occupy such a unique role when others also possess important responsibilities? The narrative responds through a direct divine intervention. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam are summoned to the entrance of the tabernacle. There, God addresses the issue publicly. What follows is one of the clearest explanations of Moses' position found anywhere in the Old Testament. The text acknowledges that God communicates with prophets through visions and dreams. Moses, however, is described differently. His relationship with God is portrayed as uniquely direct. The emphasis is not that Aaron and Miriam lack legitimate authority. The narrative explicitly recognizes their roles. The issue is that Moses' calling operates within a distinct category. The challenge, therefore, is not about whether Aaron and Miriam possess influence. It is about whether they correctly understand the nature of Moses' appointment. According to the narrative, they do not. Following this declaration, Miriam is struck with a skin disease often translated in older English versions as leprosy. Modern scholars note that the precise medical condition cannot be determined with certainty from the text alone. What is clear is that the affliction rendered her visibly unclean according to Israel's ritual categories. One of the most frequently discussed questions in this chapter concerns why Miriam receives the visible punishment while Aaron does not. The text itself offers no explicit explanation. Some commentators suggest Miriam may have been the primary spokesperson in the dispute. Others propose that Aaron's priestly responsibilities influenced the outcome. Still others acknowledge that the narrative simply does not provide enough information to know with certainty. Responsible interpretation requires recognizing those limits rather than presenting speculation as established fact. Whatever the reason, the judgment immediately changes the tone of the story. The discussion about authority is replaced by concern for Miriam's condition. At this point, Aaron's response becomes especially important. Unlike earlier moments in his life, particularly during the golden calf incident, Aaron does not attempt to justify his actions or shift responsibility elsewhere. Instead, he turns to Moses and openly acknowledges that he and Miriam have acted foolishly. The language he uses reflects urgency and humility. He asks Moses not to allow the consequences of the situation to continue. This response marks a notable development in Aaron's character. The narrative presents a leader who recognizes the seriousness of what has happened and seeks reconciliation rather than self-defense. Moses' reaction is equally revealing. Despite being the target of criticism, he does not seek vindication. Instead, he immediately intercedes on Miriam's behalf and prays for her healing. The story therefore moves from conflict toward restoration. Miriam is required to remain outside the camp for a period of time, but she is eventually restored and allowed to rejoin the community. The nation waits for her return before continuing its journey. This detail is often overlooked, yet it highlights Miriam's importance within Israel. The story ends not with permanent division, but with reintegration. From a leadership perspective, Numbers 12 addresses an issue that appears in many historical settings. Communities often contain multiple leaders with different responsibilities, gifts, and areas of authority. Problems can arise when those distinctions become blurred or contested. The narrative does not suggest that Aaron and Miriam were unimportant. In fact, their significance is assumed throughout the chapter. The issue is recognizing that different forms of authority can coexist without being identical. Moses' role did not diminish Aaron's priesthood or Miriam's prophetic ministry. The conflict emerged when comparison replaced clarity regarding those distinctions. Another noteworthy aspect of the chapter is its restraint. The narrative does not portray Aaron and Miriam as villains. Neither does it present Moses as a triumphant victor. Instead, it depicts a family conflict with national implications. The focus remains on correction, clarification, and restoration rather than humiliation. This approach contributes to the realism of the account. Leadership tensions are treated as part of the human experience, rather than as evidence that the entire system has failed. By the end of the chapter, the immediate crisis has been resolved. Moses continues in his unique role. Aaron remains high priest. Miriam returns to the community. Yet, the episode leaves an important lesson behind. Israel's leadership structure has been publicly reaffirmed, but questions concerning authority within the nation have not disappeared entirely. In fact, a much larger challenge is approaching. Unlike the disagreement involving Aaron and Miriam, the next conflict will not be limited to a family dispute. It will develop into a public rebellion involving hundreds of influential individuals. And at the center of that rebellion will stand a man named Korah, whose challenge will directly target the legitimacy of Aaron's priesthood itself. The events of the previous chapter clarified an important principle within Israel's leadership structure. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam each possessed legitimate responsibilities, yet those responsibilities were not identical. The challenge raised by Aaron and Miriam had been resolved through divine intervention, and the existing order remained intact. However, the question of authority did not disappear from Israel's camp. As the wilderness journey continued, dissatisfaction and frustration continued to surface among different groups within the community. The next challenge would prove far more serious than a family dispute. It would involve hundreds of participants, directly target Aaron's priesthood, and become one of the most dramatic confrontations in the entire Pentateuch. At the center of the crisis stood a Levite named Korah. The rebellion described in Numbers 16 is significant not only because of its outcome, but because of the questions it raises about leadership, authority, and the organization of the covenant community. One of the most important details in the story is Korah's background. He was not an outsider, foreign enemy, or opponent of Israel's faith. He belonged to the tribe of Levi, the same tribe from which Aaron came. This fact immediately distinguishes the rebellion from many previous conflicts in the wilderness. The challenge originates from within Israel's religious structure rather than from outside it. Korah was joined by Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben, along with 250 prominent community leaders. The narrative emphasizes their status. These were not obscure individuals. They were recognized figures within the congregation, men who possessed influence and standing among the people. The scale of the movement suggests that dissatisfaction extended beyond a small circle of personal rivals. The complaint presented by Korah and his supporters appears straightforward. They accuse Moses and Aaron of elevating themselves above the rest of the community. Their argument is based on a statement that sounds compelling at first glance. The entire congregation is holy, and the Lord is among all of them. Why then should Moses and Aaron occupy positions that seem higher than everyone else? The challenge is rhetorically powerful because it appeals to a genuine biblical truth. Israel had indeed been called a holy nation. Covenant identity belonged to the people as a whole. Yet the narrative suggests that Korah's movement draws a conclusion the text considers mistaken. Holiness of the community does not eliminate distinctions of responsibility within the community. The rebellion, therefore, centers on the relationship between shared identity and assigned roles. Moses' response is striking. Rather than defending himself through political argument or personal authority, he immediately falls face down. This reaction appears repeatedly throughout the wilderness narratives whenever Moses encounters major crises. Instead of framing the issue as a personal attack, he treats it as a matter requiring divine judgment. The response also shifts attention away from personalities and toward the underlying question. The issue is not whether Moses and Aaron are more valuable than others. The issue is whether their positions originate from human ambition or divine appointment. Moses proposes a test designed to answer that question. Korah and his followers are instructed to take censers, place incense in them, and present themselves before the Lord. Aaron will do the same. The symbolism of the test is important. Incense was closely associated with priestly service and access to sacred space. By focusing on censers and incense, the challenge is directed specifically toward Aaron's priesthood, rather than Moses' broader leadership role. The test will reveal who has been authorized to perform these functions within the covenant structure. The following day, the confrontation reaches its climax. Korah, the 250 leaders, and the broader assembly gather before the tabernacle. The scene combines political tension, religious symbolism, and public expectation. The issue can no longer remain theoretical. A resolution is required. According to the narrative, the glory of the Lord appears before the congregation, signaling that the matter will be settled directly rather than through negotiation. What follows is among the most dramatic judgment scenes in the Old Testament. Dathan and Abiram refuse Moses' summons and remain near their tents. Moses announces that a unique sign will reveal whether he and Aaron have been sent by God. The ground then opens beneath the rebels, swallowing them along with their households. Simultaneously, fire comes from the Lord and consumes the 250 men offering incense. ancient readers would have recognized the extraordinary nature of the imagery. The earth itself becomes an instrument of judgment, while the fire echoes earlier moments involving unauthorized approaches to sacred responsibilities. The outcome leaves no ambiguity regarding the narrative's conclusion. The challenge against Aaron's priesthood has been rejected. Yet, the story does not end with the destruction of the rebels. One of the most surprising developments occurs immediately afterward. Instead of accepting the result, many Israelites begin complaining against Moses and Aaron. They accuse them of causing the deaths of the Lord's people. This reaction reveals an important aspect of the wilderness narratives. Public conflict does not always disappear simply because a decision has been rendered. Communities often carry unresolved frustrations that continue shaping how events are interpreted. The rebellion may have been defeated, but dissatisfaction remained present within the camp. From Aaron's perspective, the rebellion represents a critical moment in his story. Previous chapters focused on his family, his priestly office, and his relationship with Moses. Number 16 places the priesthood itself under examination. The challenge is no longer personal criticism. It is a direct attack on the legitimacy of the office Aaron occupies. The narrative's resolution, therefore, functions as a public confirmation of that office. Aaron does not defend himself through speeches or demonstrations of personal ability. Instead, the legitimacy of the priesthood is established through the outcome of the confrontation itself. Another important dimension of the chapter concerns Korah's motivations. The text portrays him as a Levite, who already possessed meaningful responsibilities within Israel's religious life. His dissatisfaction does not arise from exclusion from the covenant community. Rather, it appears connected to a desire for responsibilities beyond those already assigned to him. This observation has led many commentators to view the story as a reflection on ambition within leadership structures. The issue is not whether Korah's existing role mattered. The issue is his rejection of the distinctions established within the covenant order. Historically and theologically, the rebellion became one of the defining examples of resistance to divinely appointed authority. Later, Jewish and Christian traditions frequently referred to Korah when discussing pride, rebellion, and challenges to legitimate leadership. Yet within the immediate context of Aaron's story, the event serves a more specific purpose. It publicly reinforces the position of the high priest at a moment when that position faced its greatest challenge. By the end of the chapter, the rebellion appears defeated, but the crisis is not entirely over. The complaints spreading through the camp are about to trigger a new disaster. A deadly plague will begin moving through the congregation, threatening thousands of lives. And in the midst of that catastrophe, Aaron will perform the single act that most clearly reveals the purpose of his priestly office. The next chapter will not focus on challenges to Aaron's authority. Instead, it will reveal what that authority was ultimately meant to accomplish when he stands between the living and the dead. The rebellion of Korah ended with a dramatic confirmation of Aaron's priesthood, but it did not immediately restore stability to the nation. The challenge against Moses and Aaron had been answered, the rebels had been judged, and the legitimacy of the existing leadership structure had been reaffirmed. Yet, the wilderness narratives repeatedly demonstrate that public crises rarely disappear in a single moment. Even after witnessing extraordinary events, many within the congregation remained dissatisfied. The chapter that follows the rebellion, therefore, shifts attention away from the question of who possesses authority and toward a different question entirely. What is the purpose of that authority? Why does the priesthood exist? Numbers 16 answers that question through one of the most memorable scenes in Aaron's entire life. It is not a story about political leadership, institutional structure, or personal status. It is a story about responsibility in the face of catastrophe. The episode begins the day after Korah's rebellion. Rather than accepting the outcome, Many Israelites gather once again against Moses and Aaron. Their accusation is remarkable. They claim that Moses and Aaron have caused the deaths of the Lord's people. From a narrative perspective, the complaint reveals how deeply divided the community has become. The events of the previous chapter had settled the issue of authority, yet they had not healed the underlying tensions within the camp. The congregation continued interpreting recent events through the lens of frustration and resentment. The result was another confrontation at a moment when the nation was already vulnerable. As the people assembled, the biblical text records that the glory of the Lord appeared at the tabernacle. The appearance signals that the situation has entered a new and dangerous phase. A plague begins spreading through the congregation. Unlike the judgment that fell specifically upon Korah and his followers, this disaster extends into the wider community. The crisis is immediate. People are dying. The threat is moving rapidly through the camp. The narrative deliberately creates a sense of urgency. There is no opportunity for lengthy debate, investigation, or negotiation. A response is required at once. At this critical moment, Moses gives Aaron a specific instruction. He is told to take a censer, place fire from the altar into it, add incense, and move quickly into the midst of the congregation. The details are significant because they draw directly from the priestly responsibilities established in earlier chapters. The solution to the crisis is not military action, administrative reform, or public persuasion. The response comes through an act connected to the priestly office itself. Aaron immediately obeys. One of the most striking aspects of the narrative is the speed of his response. The text emphasizes movement. Aaron does not remain at a distance observing the disaster. He runs toward it. This detail may seem minor, but it contributes significantly to the scene's emotional impact. Throughout the wilderness narratives, moments of danger often provoke fear, hesitation, or resistance. Here, Aaron moves directly into the center of the crisis. The action reflects decisiveness rather than caution. Whatever questions may have surrounded his leadership earlier in life, none are visible in this moment. The image that follows has become one of the most powerful in the entire Old Testament. Aaron stands between the living and the dead, and the plague is stopped. The sentence is brief, yet its symbolic significance is extraordinary. On one side are those who have already fallen. On the other side are those still threatened by the advancing judgment. Between those two realities stands the high priest holding a censer of incense. The narrative transforms a historical event into a visual representation of priestly responsibility. Aaron is neither the source of the judgment nor the source of life. Instead, he occupies the space between them. For many readers, this scene captures the essence of the priesthood more clearly than any technical description ever could. Earlier chapters explained how the priesthood was established. They described consecration rituals, sacred garments, and institutional responsibilities. This chapter demonstrates what those responsibilities looked like in practice. The office exists not merely to oversee ceremonies, but to serve the covenant community in moments of crisis. The scene, therefore, provides a practical answer to questions raised throughout the previous chapters. Why was Aaron chosen? Why was the priesthood established? Why did the rebellion of Korah matter? The narrative's answer is that the priesthood exists to fulfill a specific role within Israel's relationship with God. Historical and theological discussions of this chapter often focus on the concept of intercession. Intercession involves acting on behalf of others in situations where assistance is needed. The idea appears repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. Moses intercedes for Israel after the golden calf. Abraham intercedes concerning Sodom. Prophets frequently intercede for the nation. Numbers 16 presents Aaron performing a similar function within the framework of priestly service. The chapter is less concerned with explaining the mechanics of the plague than with illustrating the role Aaron occupies during the crisis. The emphasis remains on his actions rather than on theoretical discussions. Another noteworthy feature of the story is the contrast it creates with earlier events in Aaron's life. During the Golden Calf episode, Aaron responded to pressure from the people by accommodating their demands. The result was disaster. In Numbers 16, he again faces a crisis involving the broader community. But his response is entirely different. Instead of following the crowd, he acts according to the responsibilities of his office. The contrast is subtle, but significant. The narrative does not explicitly draw attention to it. Yet readers familiar with Aaron's earlier story can hardly miss the difference. The man who once struggled under public pressure now acts decisively in the service of the community. The chapter also reveals an important dimension of leadership within the biblical worldview. Authority is consistently linked to responsibility. The rebellion of Korah framed leadership primarily as privilege and status. Numbers 16 reframes it as service during moments of danger. Aaron's position is not portrayed as a means of elevating himself above others. It is portrayed as a role requiring action when the community faces crisis. The imagery of standing between the living and the dead reinforces this perspective with unusual force. The scene becomes memorable precisely because it illustrates leadership through responsibility rather than through power. By the time the plague ends, thousands have died. Yet the spread of the disaster has been halted. The nation survives another crisis. More importantly, the purpose of the priesthood has been displayed in a way that no speech or ceremony could have accomplished. The previous chapter established Aaron's legitimacy. This chapter demonstrates his function. Together, the two narratives form a complete response to the rebellion of Korah. The priesthood is both authorized and necessary within the covenant structure described by the Pentateuch. Yet one issue remains. The rebellion may have been defeated, and the purpose of the priesthood may have been demonstrated. But God is about to provide one more confirmation that Aaron has indeed been chosen for his office. The next sign will not involve fire, plague, or judgment. Instead, it will come through something far quieter, a dead piece of wood that unexpectedly bursts into life. The previous chapter answered an important question raised by Korah's rebellion. Aaron's priesthood was not merely an honorary position or a symbol of status. It served a practical purpose within Israel's covenant life. When disaster struck the camp, Aaron acted according to the responsibilities of his office, and the plague was stopped. Yet, despite the dramatic events surrounding the rebellion and its aftermath, the biblical narrative records one final confirmation of Aaron's appointment. The issue was no longer what the priesthood was designed to do. The issue was how the nation would remember, beyond any immediate crisis, that Aaron had been chosen for this role. Numbers 17 provides the answer through one of the most unusual signs in the Pentateuch. Unlike the earthquake that swallowed the rebels or the plague that spread through the camp, this sign unfolds quietly. There is no public confrontation, no crowd demanding answers, and no dramatic judgment. Instead, the story centers on 12 staffs placed before the Lord, and a single piece of wood that unexpectedly comes to life. To understand the significance of the event, it is important to consider what a staff represented in the ancient world. A staff was far more than a walking stick. Shepherds used staffs to guide and protect their flocks. Tribal leaders carried staffs as symbols of authority and responsibility. Elders and officials often possessed staffs associated with their position within the community. Throughout the Old Testament, staffs frequently appear in connection with leadership. Moses' staff played a prominent role during the confrontation with Pharaoh and throughout the Exodus journey, The staff therefore functioned as a recognizable symbol of office, identity, and authority. Against that background, the instructions given in Numbers 17 become especially meaningful. God commands Moses to collect a staff from the leader of each tribe of Israel. Aaron's name is written on the staff representing the tribe of Levi. The 12 staffs are then placed before the Lord in the tent of meeting. The arrangement is carefully designed. Every tribe is represented equally. No speeches are required. No debates take place. The question that fueled Korah's rebellion is allowed to stand on its own. Who has been chosen for the role associated with the priesthood, rather than relying upon human argument? The narrative presents a test that will be resolved through a visible sign. The following day, Moses enters the sanctuary and discovers that one staff has changed. Aaron's staff has sprouted buds, produced blossoms, and yielded ripe almonds. The description is remarkable because it emphasizes more than a simple sign of life. The staff displays multiple stages of growth simultaneously. Buds represent the beginning of development. Blossoms indicate maturity within the flowering process. Almonds represent fruit. The image, therefore, conveys a complete cycle of life, appearing where no life should exist. The object in question is not a living branch attached to a tree. It is a staff, a piece of wood separated from its source of life, yet it now displays unmistakable evidence of vitality. The symbolism would have been difficult for ancient readers to miss. One of the most important aspects of the story is that the sign occurs without human involvement. Aaron does not perform an action. Moses does not issue a challenge. The people do not participate in a public contest. The staffs are simply placed before the Lord and left overnight. The outcome, therefore, directs attention away from human ability and toward divine initiative. This distinction is crucial within the narrative. Korah's rebellion centered on questions of authority and legitimacy. The budding staff answers those questions by presenting Aaron's office as something established through God's choice rather than human ambition. Another fascinating element involves the almond tree itself. Scholars have long noted that almond trees occupy a distinctive place in the environment of the ancient Near East. In the land of Israel, almond trees are among the earliest to bloom at the end of winter. Because of this characteristic, they became associated with awakening, watchfulness, and the arrival of a new season. The Hebrew language even contains a wordplay connecting almonds with vigilance in another biblical passage. Whether Numbers 17 intends readers to draw all of those associations remains debated, but the selection of almonds certainly contributes to the vividness of the sign. The miracle is not random. It produces a recognizable and meaningful form of life. The event also serves as a deliberate contrast to the rebellion that preceded it. Numbers 16 is dominated by scenes of judgment. The earth opens. Fire consumes the rebels. A plague spreads through the congregation. Death becomes a recurring theme. Numbers 17 shifts the imagery dramatically. Instead of destruction, readers encounter growth. Instead of loss, they encounter fruitfulness. Instead of the earth swallowing life, a dead branch unexpectedly produces life. The transition is literary as well as theological. The narrative moves from demonstrating the consequences of rejecting God's order to illustrating the positive confirmation of that order. The staff, therefore, functions not merely as evidence against Korah's claims, but as a symbol of continuity and future purpose. Following the miracle, Moses presents the staffs to the people so that everyone can see the result. Aaron's staff is then preserved before the testimony as a lasting reminder. This detail is significant because it transforms the event from a temporary sign into an enduring memorial. Future generations would not have witnessed Korah's rebellion firsthand, but the preserved staff would serve as a reminder of what had occurred. The narrative is concerned not only with resolving an immediate dispute, but also with preventing future disputes based on the same questions. Historically speaking, the preservation of symbolic objects played an important role in many ancient societies. Such objects connected later generations with foundational events and reinforced communal memory. From the perspective of Aaron's story, the budding staff represents one of the clearest public affirmations of his office. Earlier chapters established his position through consecration, ceremonies, and priestly responsibilities. The rebellion of Korah tested that position. The plague demonstrated its function. The budding staff now provides a visible and lasting confirmation. Together, these episodes form a coherent sequence. The narrative moves from appointment to challenge, from challenge to demonstration, and from demonstration to confirmation. Each stage builds upon the one before it. Yet despite these affirmations, Aaron's story is approaching a different phase. The central questions concerning his authority have largely been resolved. The priesthood has been established. His position has been publicly confirmed. The narrative now shifts toward the later years of the wilderness journey. There, a new challenge awaits, one that will not involve rebellious followers, rival leaders, or questions about legitimacy. Instead, it will involve Aaron himself. At a place called Meribah, an incident involving water from a rock will lead to one of the most consequential decisions in his entire life. For the first time since the golden calf, Aaron will again find himself at the center of a failure, whose consequences will reach far into the future. By the time we reach this stage of Aaron's story, the major questions that once surrounded his leadership have largely been settled. The priesthood has been established. Korah's rebellion has been defeated. Aaron's staff has budded as a public confirmation of his office. For many readers, these developments create the impression that the final years of Aaron's life will proceed without major disruption. Yet, the wilderness narratives rarely move in a straight line, even after decades of leadership. Significant challenges continue to emerge. Numbers 20 introduces one of the most important episodes in Aaron's later life, not because it involves a national rebellion or a dramatic miracle, but because it reveals the consequences of a single act that alters the future of both Aaron and Moses. The event takes place at Meribah and becomes a turning point in the story of Israel's journey toward the Promised Land. The setting is familiar. The Israelites once again find themselves facing a shortage of water. For readers who have followed the wilderness narrative from the beginning, the situation echoes earlier episodes. Water had been a recurring concern throughout the journey. The wilderness environment was harsh and unpredictable. Access to reliable water sources was often a matter of survival rather than convenience. As in previous crises, the people gather against Moses and Aaron. Their complaints reflect frustration, fear, and disappointment. They question why they were brought into the wilderness and express dissatisfaction with their circumstances. The narrative intentionally highlights a pattern that has appeared repeatedly across Israel's journey. Moments of hardship often expose deeper tensions concerning trust, leadership, and expectations. What makes this episode different is not the complaint itself, but the response that follows. Moses and Aaron go before the Lord seeking guidance. According to the text, God provides clear instructions. Moses is told to take the staff, assemble the people, and speak to the rock before their eyes. Water will come forth, and the immediate crisis will be resolved. The command is notable for its simplicity. The miracle is to occur through speaking, rather than through a dramatic physical action. Earlier in Israel's history, a different incident involving water from a rock had included striking the rock with a staff. Here, however, the instruction is different. The distinction becomes crucial because the narrative's central issue emerges from what happens next. Moses and Aaron gather the congregation as instructed. standing before the people. Moses addresses them with visible frustration. He calls them rebels and asks whether he and Aaron must bring water out of the rock for them. Then, rather than speaking to the rock, Moses strikes it twice with his staff. Water immediately pours out, providing what the people need. On the surface, the outcome appears successful. The crisis is resolved. The congregation receives water. The miracle occurs. Yet the narrative immediately reveals that the event cannot be evaluated solely by its practical result. God declares that Moses and Aaron have failed to trust him and have not upheld his holiness before the people. As a consequence, neither man will lead the nation into the promised land. This announcement has puzzled readers for centuries. At first glance, the punishment appears severe. Water was provided exactly as promised. The people survived. Why should the incident carry such lasting consequences? The answer lies in the way the biblical text frames the issue significantly. The narrative does not focus primarily on the miracle itself. Instead, it emphasizes trust, obedience, and representation. The problem is not that water came from the rock. The problem concerns how Moses and Aaron carried out the task entrusted to them. Scholars and interpreters have proposed several explanations for the offense at Meribah. One common interpretation focuses on obedience. God instructed Moses to speak to the rock, but Moses struck it instead. From this perspective, the issue involves failure to follow a specific command. The distinction may appear minor to modern readers, yet within the context of the narrative it becomes highly significant. The miracle was intended to occur in a particular way, and Moses and Aaron did not follow those instructions precisely. Another interpretation emphasizes the public nature of the event. Moses and Aaron occupied positions of extraordinary visibility within Israel. Their actions communicated something about God's character to the nation. When Moses addressed the people in anger and struck the rock, some commentators argue that he presented a distorted picture of the divine response to the situation. The text itself points in this direction by stating that God's holiness was not properly honored before the people. The issue, therefore, extends beyond procedure. It concerns representation. Leaders entrusted with sacred responsibilities are expected to reflect accurately the purposes of the one they serve. A third line of interpretation focuses on Moses' words. His question, whether he and Aaron must bring water from the rock, has led some scholars to suggest that the language unintentionally shifted attention away from God and toward human leaders. The narrative does not explicitly accuse Moses and Aaron of claiming divine power for themselves, but many commentators view the wording as part of the broader problem. Regardless of which interpretation receives the greatest emphasis, the text consistently directs attention toward the same conclusion. Something in the actions of Moses and Aaron failed to align with the trust and obedience required of their roles. Aaron's inclusion in the judgment is particularly important, unlike some earlier episodes where Moses occupied the central position. Numbers 20 specifically names both leaders. The consequence applies equally to each of them. This detail reinforces a theme that has been developing throughout Aaron's story. The priesthood, despite its significance, does not place its holder above accountability. Aaron's office had been confirmed through consecration, through the defeat of Korah's rebellion, and through the miracle of the budding staff. Yet none of those affirmations exempted him from responsibility. The narrative maintains a clear distinction between divine calling and personal conduct. Possessing a sacred office does not remove the obligation to act faithfully within that office, historically and literarily. Meribah marks the beginning of the end of an era. The generation that left Egypt is disappearing. Miriam has already died earlier in the chapter. Aaron and Moses now learn that they will not complete the journey they began decades earlier. The leaders who confronted Pharaoh, crossed the sea, and stood at Sinai will not enter the land toward which they have been traveling. The announcement introduces a new reality into the narrative. Attention begins shifting toward succession and the future. The mission will continue, but not under the leadership of the same generation that began it. The emotional impact of this development should not be underestimated. Aaron has devoted much of his life to the formation of Israel as a covenant people. He has witnessed extraordinary events, carried enormous responsibilities, and endured personal losses. Yet the destination remains just beyond his reach. The narrative does not dwell on his reaction, but the significance of the judgment is unmistakable. The promised land, which has shaped the hopes of the nation for generations, will not become part of Aaron's personal experience. By the end of the chapter, the water crisis has been resolved, but a larger transition has begun. The questions surrounding Aaron's authority are now behind him. A new question stands before him instead. How will his story come to an end? The answer lies not in another rebellion or another miracle, but on a mountain called Hor, where Aaron's priestly garments will be transferred to the next generation, and one of the most important chapters in Israel's history will quietly draw to a close. The judgment at Meribah marked a decisive turning point in Aaron's life. For decades, the wilderness journey had been moving toward a single destination, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Aaron had witnessed nearly every major stage of that journey. He had stood before Pharaoh, crossed the sea, ascended partway up Sinai, served as Israel's first high priest, endured national crises, and watched an entire generation grow old in the wilderness. Yet after the events at Meribah, the future changed. Aaron now knew that he would not enter the promised land. The narrative begins shifting away from questions of leadership and authority and toward a different reality, the transition from one generation to the next. Numbers 20 presents this transition with remarkable simplicity and restraint. There are no dramatic public ceremonies, no political struggles over succession, and no attempts to reverse the decision that has been announced. Instead, Aaron's final chapter unfolds as a carefully ordered transfer of responsibility that signals the closing of an era in Israel's history. One of the most significant details in this stage of the narrative is its timing. The wilderness generation is approaching its end. Earlier chapters already hinted at this transition. Miriam has died. Moses and Aaron have received the judgment associated with Meribah. The nation is drawing closer to Canaan than ever before. The people standing on the edge of the promised land are increasingly different from the generation that left Egypt decades earlier. Many of those who witnessed the plagues, the crossing of the sea, and the events at Sinai have already died. Aaron's approaching death, therefore, represents more than the loss of a single individual. It symbolizes the passing of a generation that had shaped the earliest chapters of Israel's national story. Against that backdrop, God gives Moses specific instructions. Aaron and his son Eleazar are to accompany him up Mount Hor. There, Aaron's priestly garments will be removed and placed upon Eleazar. The instruction immediately highlights a theme that has been developing throughout the priesthood narratives. The office is larger than the individual who occupies it. Aaron was the first high priest, but he was never intended to be the last. The priesthood was designed to continue beyond a single lifetime. This distinction is crucial for understanding the biblical view of leadership. Individuals come and go, but institutions, responsibilities, and covenant obligations continue. The journey up Mount Hor is among the most poignant scenes in Aaron's story. Only 3 figures appear in the account: Moses, Aaron, and Eleazar. The narrative offers no extended dialogue and records no farewell speech. This silence is striking. Modern readers often expect emotional, final conversations at moments like this. Yet, the biblical text chooses a different approach. The focus remains on the transfer itself. The absence of lengthy speeches directs attention away from personal sentiment and toward the continuity of the priestly office. The story is not primarily about how Aaron feels regarding his approaching death. It is about ensuring that the responsibilities associated with his office continue without interruption. Upon reaching the mountain, Moses removes Aaron's priestly garments and places them on Eleazar. The symbolism is profound. Throughout the priesthood narratives, these garments have represented sacred responsibility, public office, and covenant service. Earlier chapters described their design in extraordinary detail. They distinguished Aaron from the rest of the community and visually communicated the role he occupied. Now, those same garments pass to another person. The transfer serves as a visible declaration that a new high priest has taken Aaron's place. Leadership is changing hands, but the priesthood itself remains intact. Historically speaking, succession was one of the most important challenges faced by ancient societies. Political leaders, military commanders, and religious officials all face the question of continuity. What happens when the current generation disappears? Many historical crises emerge precisely because succession had not been clearly established. The biblical narrative avoids that problem by presenting an orderly transfer of authority. Eleazar's appointment is not contested. The process occurs publicly and deliberately. The continuity of the priesthood is secured before Aaron's death occurs. This arrangement reinforces the stability of the institution he helped establish. Following the transfer of the garments, Aaron dies on the mountain. The text reports the event with extraordinary brevity. There is no elaborate description of his final moments. No record of his last words survives. The narrative simply states the fact of his death and then moves forward. This simplicity reflects a broader pattern often found in biblical storytelling. Important figures are remembered primarily through the significance of their lives, rather than through detailed accounts of their deaths. Aaron's legacy has already been established through the events that preceded this moment. The focus now shifts toward what comes next. Moses and Eleazar descend the mountain without him. When the congregation learns what has happened, the nation enters a period of mourning, lasting 30 days. This detail deserves careful attention. Throughout the wilderness narratives, the relationship between leaders and the people was often strained. Complaints, disagreements, and challenges occurred repeatedly. Yet, the response to Aaron's death demonstrates the respect he had earned over decades of service. The mourning period is not limited to a small group of family members or priests. The entire house of Israel participates. Whatever frustrations may have existed during his lifetime, the people recognize that a foundational figure in their history has been lost. The mourning therefore functions as a public acknowledgement of Aaron's significance. From a narrative perspective, Aaron's death creates an important contrast with many earlier episodes in his life. Much of his story involved public events, national crises, and highly visible responsibilities. The confrontation with Pharaoh, the golden calf incident, the consecration of the priesthood, Korah's rebellion, and the miracle of the budding staff all unfolded before large audiences. Mount Hor is different. The final transfer occurs in relative quiet. The scene is intimate rather than public. The absence of spectacle gives the moment a distinctive character. Aaron's life ends not in the center of a national crisis, but in the orderly completion of a responsibility he has carried for decades. Theologically, the account communicates an important principle about covenant leadership. No individual, regardless of importance, is indispensable. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam All played unique roles in Israel's development, yet each eventually passed from the scene. The covenant continued. The nation continued. The priesthood continued. This perspective prevents the story from becoming centered entirely on individual personalities. Aaron's significance lies not only in what he accomplished, but also in the way he helped establish structures that would endure after him. By the end of the chapter, the transition is complete. Eleazar now serves as high priest. The nation has mourned Aaron's death. The generation that led the Exodus is steadily disappearing. Yet Aaron's story is not quite finished. His life has reached its conclusion, but his influence extends far beyond Mount Hor. To understand the full significance of that influence, we must step outside the narrative itself and examine how historians, archaeologists, and biblical scholars have approached the figure of Aaron. The next chapter shifts from biography to investigation, asking a question that continues to generate discussion today. What can history actually tell us about the man behind the biblical story? With Aaron's death on Mount Hor, the biblical narrative of his life reaches its conclusion. The high priest who stood beside Moses during the Exodus, served at Sinai, guided Israel through decades of wilderness wandering, and established a priestly institution that would endure for centuries, has now passed from the scene. Yet, for modern readers, Aaron's story naturally raises another question. What can history tell us about him? Outside the biblical text, what evidence exists? Can archaeology confirm his life? How do scholars evaluate a figure whose influence on religious history is undeniable, but whose biography comes primarily from Scripture? These questions move us into a different kind of investigation. Instead of following the narrative itself, we now examine the evidence, the limitations of that evidence, and the major scholarly discussions surrounding one of the most important figures in the Hebrew Bible. The first point that must be stated clearly is that there is currently no direct archaeological evidence that can be conclusively linked to Aaron as an individual. No inscription bearing his name has been discovered and universally accepted as belonging to the biblical Aaron. No personal artifact can be confidently identified as having belonged to him. No contemporary Egyptian document explicitly describes his role in the events of the Exodus. For some readers, this may sound surprising. However, historians generally regard this situation as far less unusual than it might initially appear. The ancient world left behind only a tiny fraction of its records. Even many rulers, military leaders, and influential officials known from written traditions are represented by very limited archaeological evidence. The absence of direct evidence for Aaron therefore places him within a broad category of ancient figures whose lives must be reconstructed primarily through literary sources. This distinction leads to an important methodological principle. Historians distinguish between a lack of evidence and evidence against something. The fact that direct archaeological confirmation has not been found does not automatically prove that Aaron never existed. At the same time, responsible scholarship does not treat absence of evidence as positive proof of historicity. Instead, historians work with probabilities, contexts, comparative data, and surviving sources. In Aaron's case, the biblical text remains the primary source of information, while archaeology contributes indirect evidence regarding the world in which the story is set. One major area of discussion concerns the broader historical background of the Exodus narrative. While no archaeological discovery has verified Aaron personally, evidence does exist for the presence of Semitic populations in Egypt during various periods of ancient history. Egyptian texts, administrative records, and archaeological findings demonstrate that people from the Levant lived and worked within Egyptian territory. Excavations in the eastern Nile Delta have revealed settlements associated with populations that possessed cultural connections to Canaan. These discoveries do not prove the Exodus account, nor do they identify Aaron specifically. What they do demonstrate is that the broader setting described in the biblical narrative belongs to a historically plausible world rather than a purely imaginary one. Another major scholarly debate concerns the Exodus itself. Opinions vary considerably across the academic spectrum. Some scholars argue that the Exodus tradition preserves memories of genuine historical events involving groups that departed from Egypt and later became part of Israel. Others suggest that the biblical account combines historical memories with theological interpretation and literary shaping that occurred over centuries. Still others view the Exodus primarily as a foundational national tradition, whose significance does not depend entirely upon reconstructing every historical detail. Importantly, disagreement regarding the scale, date, or character of the Exodus does not automatically translate into agreement about Aaron. Different scholars reach different conclusions while often working from the same evidence. The discussion remains one of the most active fields within biblical studies. Aaron also occupies an important place within debates concerning the origins of Israel's priesthood. Many scholars view him as the central figure through whom the biblical tradition explains the emergence of the Aaronic priesthood. Here again, several perspectives exist. Some researchers argue that the traditions associated with Aaron preserve genuine memories of an early priestly leader whose descendants eventually formed an influential religious lineage. Others suggest that portions of the Aaron narrative reflect later developments within Israel's priestly community, with historical memory and institutional identity becoming closely intertwined. These discussions can become highly technical, involving linguistic analysis, textual criticism, and comparisons among different sections of the Pentateuch. Yet, beneath the complexity lies a relatively straightforward question: how did Israel come to understand the origins of its priesthood? And what role did Aaron play in that understanding? Archaeology provides indirect assistance in exploring these issues. Across the ancient Near East, excavations have uncovered temples, ritual objects, inscriptions, altars, and evidence of organized priestly activity. These discoveries reveal that priesthoods were common institutions throughout the region. Religious specialists often supervised sacrifices, maintained sacred spaces, and participated in important communal ceremonies. The existence of priestly systems in neighboring cultures does not prove the historical details of Aaron's life. However, it does help scholars understand the broader cultural environment in which Israel's priesthood developed. Aaron's role as high priest fits within a world where religious offices played major social and political roles. Another important distinction made by many scholars is the difference between the historical Aaron and the literary Aaron. The historical Aaron refers to the actual individual who may have lived during the period associated with the Exodus traditions. The literary Aaron refers to the figure presented within the biblical text. Recovering every detail about the historical Aaron may be impossible with current evidence. The literary Aaron, however, remains fully accessible through the biblical narrative. Scholars can analyze how the text portrays him, how his character develops, how his role relates to Moses, and how later traditions interpreted his significance. This distinction allows historians and literary scholars to examine the narrative seriously, even when questions regarding historical reconstruction remain unresolved. The relationship between Aaron and Moses has generated particular interest within academic discussions. Some scholars propose that traditions about Moses and traditions about Aaron may have circulated in different communities before eventually being combined within the Pentateuch. Others argue that the close association between the two brothers reflects historical memory preserved within Israel's traditions. These theories often involve source criticism and the study of how biblical texts were compiled. While conclusions differ, most scholars agree that Aaron and Moses occupy interconnected positions within the biblical narrative. Understanding one almost always requires understanding the other. Despite ongoing debates, one fact remains beyond dispute. Aaron's influence on religious history is immense. The figure described in the biblical text shaped Jewish understandings of priesthood for centuries. His descendants occupied central positions in Israel's worship life. Later, Jewish traditions expanded upon his legacy and often portrayed him as a model of peace and communal harmony. Christian writers also engaged extensively with Aaron's story, particularly when discussing priesthood, worship, and sacred service. Whether viewed historically, literarily, or theologically, Aaron became one of the most influential figures in biblical tradition. This reality leads to an important conclusion. Historical investigation can illuminate the world in which Aaron's story emerged, clarify the debates surrounding its interpretation, and identify the limits of current evidence. What it cannot do is fully explain why Aaron's story has remained meaningful across more than 3,000 years of religious history. The persistence of his influence extends beyond archaeology and textual criticism alone. It belongs to the continuing impact of the ideas associated with his life. Questions about leadership, worship, responsibility, authority, and covenant identity continue to resonate long after the historical details themselves become difficult to verify. And that brings us to the final chapter of this story. After examining Aaron through the lenses of Scripture, history, and scholarship, one final question remains. Why does Aaron still matter today? After tracing Aaron's life from the fields of Egypt to the slopes of Mount Hor, from his first appearance as Moses' older brother to his final role as Israel's first high priest, we arrive at the last and perhaps most important question of all. Why does Aaron still matter today? Historical figures are often remembered because they achieved military victories, founded kingdoms, or changed political systems. Aaron is remembered for a different reason. His influence has endured not because he built an empire or led armies into battle, but because his story addresses questions that remain relevant across cultures, generations, and religious traditions. Even readers who approach the Bible primarily as history or literature often discover that Aaron's life speaks to enduring realities about leadership, institutions, community, and human nature. One reason Aaron remains significant is that his story provides a rare portrait of how major institutions begin. Modern readers often encounter established systems without thinking about their origins. Religious traditions, leadership structures, and communal practices can appear permanent, simply because they have existed for so long. Aaron's story takes us back to the formative stage, when those structures were still being created. Through his life, we witness the emergence of Israel's priesthood, the organization of worship around the tabernacle, and the development of roles that would shape Jewish history for centuries. In this sense, Aaron is not merely a participant in Israel's story. He stands at the beginning of one of its most influential institutions. Understanding Aaron, therefore, helps modern readers understand how religious communities preserve continuity across generations. Another reason for Aaron's enduring relevance lies in the complexity of his character. Many ancient narratives present important figures in highly idealized terms. The biblical text takes a different approach. Aaron is neither portrayed as a flawless hero nor reduced to a single mistake. Instead, readers encounter a figure whose life contains courage, hesitation, success, error, responsibility, and loss. He stands before Pharaoh during one of the most dangerous confrontations in Israel's history. He participates in the establishment of the priesthood. He also becomes involved in the golden calf incident. The narrative preserves both sides of the story. This complexity contributes significantly to Aaron's lasting appeal because it reflects the realities of human experience more accurately than a portrait of perfection ever could. Aaron also remains important because his life illustrates the difference between position and responsibility. Throughout the narrative, public attention often focuses on visible offices, whether that means Moses' leadership or Aaron's priesthood. Yet, the biblical text repeatedly directs attention toward the obligations attached to those roles. The priesthood is presented not as a symbol of prestige, but as a framework of duties connected to worship, teaching, sacrifice, and service. The rebellion of Korah challenged the legitimacy of Aaron's position, but the narrative's response emphasized function rather than privilege. Aaron's role mattered because of what it required him to do, not because of the status it conferred. This distinction continues to resonate in discussions of leadership today. Institutions remain healthy when offices are understood primarily through responsibility rather than personal advancement. Another aspect of Aaron's legacy involves the relationship between individuals and institutions. Many biblical figures are remembered primarily for personal achievements. Aaron's influence extends beyond his individual actions because he helped establish a structure that continued after his death. The priesthood survived the wilderness generation, the conquest of Canaan, the period of the judges, the monarchy, the exile, and the restoration. Historians often note that institutions play a critical role in preserving cultural and religious identity over long periods of time. Aaron's story provides a case study in how one generation can create systems that shape many generations to come. His importance, therefore, cannot be measured solely by events that occurred during his lifetime. It must also be measured by the enduring impact of the institution associated with his name. The historical discussions explored in the previous chapter introduce another reason Aaron remains relevant. Whether scholars approach him primarily as a historical figure, a literary figure, or a theological figure, his story continues to generate meaningful conversation. Questions concerning the origins of Israel, the development of priestly traditions, and the formation of biblical texts remain active areas of research. Aaron stands near the center of many of those discussions. This continuing scholarly interest demonstrates that his significance extends beyond devotional reading alone. He remains an important subject within the study of history, religion, literature, and the ancient Near East. Few figures from the Pentateuch occupy such a broad intersection of disciplines. Aaron's story also offers a valuable perspective on the nature of leadership during periods of transition. Nearly every major phase of his life occurs during moments of change. He experiences the shift from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to the wilderness, from an unorganized population to a covenant nation, and from a temporary community to an emerging religious system. Leaders throughout history have faced similar challenges whenever societies undergo transformation. The details differ, but the underlying dynamics often remain recognizable. Aaron's experiences, therefore, provide insight into how communities navigate uncertainty, adaptation, and institutional development. Yet, perhaps the most enduring aspect of Aaron's story is the way it preserves memory. For more than 3,000 years, Jewish and Christian traditions have continued to read, interpret, discuss, and debate the events associated with his life. Entire generations have encountered Aaron through worship, scholarship, education, and storytelling. This persistence is remarkable when viewed historically. Countless individuals who once occupied positions of authority in the ancient world have been forgotten. Aaron has not. The reason extends beyond historical curiosity. His story became attached to larger themes that communities considered worth preserving. Questions about worship, authority, community, responsibility, and sacred tradition continued to matter. And as long as those questions remained important, Aaron's story remained relevant as well. Looking back across the entire narrative, one pattern becomes especially clear. Aaron's significance does not rest upon a single event. It emerges from the cumulative effect of many interconnected episodes. His early years in Egypt explain his background. His partnership with Moses places him at the center of the Exodus. Sinai introduces his future role. The priesthood defines his public legacy. Korah's rebellion tests that legacy. The budding staff confirms it. Meribah reminds readers that even the most important leaders operate within limits. Mount Hor marks the transition to a new generation. Each chapter contributes something necessary to the whole. Remove any one of them, and the portrait becomes incomplete. Together they create a biography that is as much about the formation of a nation as it is about the life of one man. Ultimately, Aaron remains important because his story helps explain how Israel became Israel. Through his life, readers witness the emergence of leadership structures, priestly traditions, covenant worship, and institutional continuity. Through his family, they observe the beginning of a lineage that would shape centuries of religious history. Through the events surrounding him, they gain a deeper understanding of the wilderness generation that stood between Egypt and the Promised Land. Aaron's story therefore functions on multiple levels at once. It is the biography of a person, the history of an institution, and part of the larger narrative of a people discovering their identity. That combination explains why his name continues to be remembered long after the world in which he lived has disappeared. And it is why, more than 3 millennia later, the story of Aaron still deserves to be told.